Esher, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 3. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 1. Rain hammered the pavement around him, scoured the walls of the towering buildings that hemmed him in and stole the clouds from view with their bright neon signs, and saturated the two demons gathering their wits around 50 feet from him in the narrow Tokyo alley. It mingled with the black blood that turned the air rank and coppery, a stench he wanted to erase from this world. And he would. Esher moved forwards, through the heavy droplets that began to gather and condense, responding to the hunger mounting inside him, a desire to eradicate the foul creatures stumbling onto their feet now. At the far end of the narrow street beyond them, a mortal male tucked beneath a clear convenience store umbrella paused and glanced their way. Big mistake. The darkness was swift to rise, to pound in Esher's blood like a tide that battered him, powerful waves that rolled over him and washed all the light away. On a black snarl, he pressed the toe of his right boot into the wet pavement and launched forwards, little more than a blur as he closed the distance between him and his prey. The male demon swiftly turned his way and stepped in front of his comrade, a female. Protecting her? Valen had reported the demons in Rome had done something similar. As if the creatures were capable of feeling anything tender or sweet. They were as devoid of softer emotions as he was. But still, the male reached behind him and shoved her in the hip, forcing her to stumble out of the firing line just as Esher threw his right hand forwards. The rain that had been gathering around him exploded towards the male, whipping into a spiraling spear as it zoomed away from Esher. It hit the male with the force of a tidal wave, sending him flying through the air. The wretched demon hit the pavement near the far end of the alley and rolled to a halt next to the mortal. Esher growled and spat on the pavement, the gnawing hunger growing stronger as he stared at the wretched human. It would pay in blood for daring to remain near him, for daring to gaze upon him. It would pay in its own blood. His lips stretched into a cold grin, the lower one stinging as the cut on it pulled, filling his mouth with the metallic tang of his own blood. He twitched as memories surged, wrapped around him, and felt as if they were pulling him down into them with claws that shredded his insides, tore his heart to pieces. Blood. So much red. He had never seen so much of it, had emptied his stomach more than once when they had been butchering the male in front of him, spilling crimson and flesh on the hay and dirt. Their sick laughter had prodded at him, ripping at his strength and dragging him down. He had been weak, stripped of his powers, left vulnerable. He had been an easy target for their fear, their rage. They had beaten him, tore more of his strength from him. He had been weaker, wounded, bound and broken. But fucking gods, he had shown them the error of their ways when his power had returned, just as he would show this human. Esher reached his left hand out and focused on the mortal male. It took only a brief thought. One moment the male was standing, the next he was prone on the floor, blood leaking from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. Weak. Humans were weak. Pathetic. Unworthy of the protection of the gods. Thunder rolled overhead, golden lightning striking a split second later, snapping at the buildings that loomed over him and tearing a fearful gasp from the demons. A warning from the king of gods. His uncle could go fuck himself. The mortals deserved death. He wasn't on this plane to protect them. He was here to protect one realm, the underworld, his home. This entire world could burn and he wouldn't give a shit as long as his home was safe. The male demon picked himself up, pausing to look at the dead human, his dark eyes wide and a flicker of fear emerging in them as he turned them on Esher. And the female. The blonde staggered onto her feet, clutching her stomach, her limbs visibly trembling beneath her long black raincoat that matched the one the male wore. They had come prepared for the turn in the weather. It was almost a shame they hadn't come prepared to win. It had been a long time since he had fought a worthy adversary. Karis's words rang in his ears. An adversary was coming for him, one of the group bent on destroying the gates to the underworld that he and his brothers protected, all in an effort to merge the worlds and claim dominion over both. Esher just hoped they were worthy. He wanted a good fight, one that would test him to his limit. Fire tore through his right arm, and he grunted and snapped back to the alley. The blonde bitch leaped away from him, her silver knife stained crimson, with his blood. It rolled down his forearm to his wrist beneath the sleeve of his long black coat, and he raised his hand before him and watched it drip to the ground, to dissipate in the water beneath his leather boots. Water that began to vibrate, tiny droplets of it bouncing higher and higher into the air as he stared at the blood flowing along the side of his hand, to bead at the tip of his little finger and fall. Typical of inferior creatures to use weapons in a battle. He had never understood why some of his brothers relied on them too, one or two of them even favoring mortal-made guns, when they were gods and wielded powers strong enough to defeat any adversary they might face. Personally, he never used weapons. His powers were more than enough. Without even taking his eyes off the blood, he flicked his left hand towards the female as she launched at him again, her blade flashing in the neon lights and a battle cry on her lips. It turned into a scream. She dropped from the air, landing in a shaking heap on the wet pavement, her convulsions growing more and more violent as he slowly turned his gaze on her. Hatred seethed inside him as he looked at her, as he commanded every molecule of her vile blood to dance to his song. He despised using his power over water to end his prey in such a way, because it was just too easy. But she had brought it upon herself. "No!" the male barked and sprinted towards her. He sank to his knees at her side and grabbed her arm, pulling her onto her back. Too late. Black blood rolled from her eyes and her mouth, streamed from her nose and her ears. Esher closed his right hand into a fist. Her body lurched upwards as her heart exploded. "Bastard!" The male demon shoved to his feet. Esher slowly smiled, crooked a blood-stained finger. Flames licked over his left side, and he grunted as he clutched it through his coat and gray-blue shirt. Waves of heat rolled through him, each stronger than the last. He gritted his teeth as his vision wobbled, shadows dancing across the alley before him, swirling around the corpses and drifting towards him. No, he wasn't sick now. He was safe, healed. The intense burning in his side mocked him, screamed that he wasn't healed, was far from it. The Wraith's blade had done more damage than anyone had suspected, and more than Ares' female could mend. He could feel it. It had been weeks since the attack, and his body could heal even the most vicious of injuries in less than a day. He should have been healed by now. But the pain lingered, came in sharp bursts from time to time, to remind him that he had let his guard down and paid the ultimate price. Or he would have if a mortal hadn't saved him. He chuckled through his gritted teeth at that. "You won't be laughing in a minute!" The male voice came from behind him, and Esher heard other words, in another male's deep voice. "Give your sister my regards." Fiery agony streaked across his side, just as it had that night in that heart-stopping moment before everything had gone black. But this time the flames licked at his right side, just below his ribs. He grunted as the pain combined with the lingering effect of the Wraith's blade, stripping more of his strength from him. The shadows scattered as he growled and focused on the male behind him now, not the one who had been there on that rooftop almost 2 months ago. Esher raised his right arm and slammed his elbow into the male's cheek, and grunted in time with him as the demon was knocked sideways, and his blade scraped over bone before sucking free of Esher's flesh. Heat spread down Esher's side, and he clamped his left hand down over the wound, spun on his heel, and grabbed the male by his throat. He kicked hard, shoving the male into the concrete wall of one of the buildings with enough force to break bone. The male screamed as several of them shattered and choked on blood that burst from his lips, coating them. Water streamed over his face as the rain fell harder, so thick and fast that it created a wall around them, shutting out the world. Esher reined in his hunger, breathing hard as he wrestled with the need to butcher the male, and then turn his sights on anyone else in the vicinity. He focused on each breath, his hand shaking against the demon's throat with a need to reach into the breast pocket of his gray-blue shirt and pull out the noise-canceling earbuds. He needed the quiet, the solitude. He needed to let the strings wash over him and sweep the world away. He could have it, but first he had to ease back on the demon's throat and do what he had promised to do. "Who sent you?" Information. He and his brothers had all agreed to get information out of any demon that dared attempt to reach their gate, but Esher had forgotten all about it when the female demon had clawed and bitten him when he had caught them near it, drawing blood and pissing him off. Toying with the bitch had become priority one, shortly followed by killing her. Getting information hadn't even ranked. It was a miracle he wasn't bursting the male demon like the pustule he was, and was instead attempting to get something out of him, although it seemed he had failed to rein his temper in quickly enough. The male sagged in his grip, his weight tugging Esher's arm down, and sending a fresh wave of pain rolling up it from the cut on his forearm. Esher huffed and discarded the dead male. The rain eased enough that he could see the female. His brothers wouldn't be pleased that he had killed them both, but they would understand when he told them he had done his best. He wasn't the only brother with a habit of forgetting to get information. So far, Diamond was in the lead. His younger brother had killed almost 50% of the demons who had attempted to get through the Hong Kong gate, only remembering after they were frozen popsicles or shattered into meaty pieces that he was meant to beat information out of them before killing them. Esher drew his hand away from his right side and frowned at the blood coating his palm. It caught the light of the narrow signs that jutted out from each building, running their entire height to mark what was on each floor, and reflected white, red, and yellow back at him. The wound would heal rapidly, not like the Wraith wound, but he would have to conserve his strength until it had knitted back together, which meant he couldn't teleport home. Stepping, as he and his brothers called it, would drain him, and it was only just gone 1 in the morning, meaning there was still another 4 or 5 hours of darkness in which another demon could attempt to find the gate. Or a hellspawn, one of the accepted species in his father's eyes, and one allowed to enter the underworld via the gates, could call on him to open it. So he would have to do the unthinkable: public transport. He ground his molars and reached into the breast pocket of his shirt, tugged the tiny headphones out and jammed them into his ears. Instantly the soothing melody of Bach filled him, swamping the song of the rain and the grating noise of Tokyo. Esher took a few deep breaths, giving the beautiful classical piece time to do its work, and then trudged forwards, past the 2 dead demons. He didn't look at the dead mortal as he passed the male, kept moving onwards on autopilot, slowly constructing a wall of calm inside himself. A barrier that would shut the world out and allow him to venture down into the train station and tolerate the presence of the mortals as they surrounded him, crowded him. As the strings rose, he spotted the airplane wing canopy that stretched above the central entrance of Tokyo Station, extending from the glass skyscraper to its right. Clouds swirled around the top of the towering structure, glowing yellow from the city lights. The rain continued to pour, soothing Esher as much as the music, but as he approached the entrance and the number of mortals rose, hurrying to catch the last trains, his grip on calm began to weaken. He could do this. He balled his right hand into a fist and grimaced as the cut across his forearm stung, as his muscles flexed beneath it, a flash of fire that tested him. He breathed deep, letting the flare of irritation fade without affecting his mood. He was calm, in control. Calm, control. Esher breathed through it, steeled himself, and moved forwards, avoiding the busier paths into the building. It was only a short trip, barely 15 minutes. He could do this. A mortal female passed close to him, and he tensed, his breath seizing in his throat as he leaned to avoid her, even though she was more than 10 feet away. Breathe. Calm. Control. Karis would fucking kill him if he lost his shit and caused a bloodbath. His oldest brother had lectured him more than once about playing nice around the weak little mortals. By the gods, he tried. He could almost tolerate them now. He had even managed to speak with some when he was feeling strong, able to cope with breathing the same air as them. But he wasn't feeling strong. The coppery odor of blood clouded his senses, tugging at his memories, and it was hard to keep them shut out, to hold the wall of calm in place. He shoved the bloodied fingers of his right hand through the longer lengths of his black hair, pushing the damp strands out of his face, and scrubbed at the shorter sides. He could do this. He took another step towards the building, a pressing sense of urgency building inside him, and driving him to move as he picked up the warning over the public address system. It was last train time. Now or never. He froze as a male passed him, flicking a glance his way that turned into a double take before he pivoted on his heel and hurried away from the station. Esher touched his face, drew his hand away, and looked at his fingers. Black smeared their pads. Demon blood. He huffed, grabbed the handkerchief he always kept in the back pocket of his dark blue jeans, and wiped the blood away, scrubbing his neck and face, and then his hand to clear it of both demon and his own blood. It took barely a second for the blood to roll back down to his fingers. He buttoned his coat to hide the crimson stain on his shirt, tugged the sleeve back, and wrapped the handkerchief around his forearm, covering the wound there. It would have to do. The last of the mortals ran into the building ahead of him. Esher strode towards it, his left hand closing over his right side again as the wound below his ribs burned. He pressed hard against it, stopping the flow of blood down his side, and trudged forwards, moving as quickly as he could manage. The lights inside the station stung his eyes, and he lowered his head, letting the hand-length ribbons of his black hair fall forwards over his brow to shield them. He kept his head bent as he hurried past the closed shops towards the Yamanote line. It would stop at Yoyogi Park, and he could walk from there. The streets in that neighborhood would be quiet, unlike the immense room around him. Someone almost ran into him as they rushed towards the ticket barriers, and he bared his teeth at their back. Karras would have to forgive him if someone bumped him, because he wasn't sure he had the strength to stop himself from hurting them. It was leaking from him as he passed his bloodied right hand over the card reader on the barrier, using his abilities to force it to open for him. It swung open and he passed through, scanned the area ahead of him, and spotted the sign for a line. It was further than he remembered. He was going to have to use a little bit of power to make it to the train. Not stepping, just running. He clutched his side and sprinted, passing the mortals with ease, and reached the platform just as the last train pulled in. He boarded at the first door and moved down through the carriages until he found one that was quiet. The seats near the next car were empty, so he slumped into them, arranging himself in a way that put off the mortals who were eyeing the spot beside him. He looked at his bloodied hand, felt a few mortals glancing there too, and then moving away. He was tempted to wipe it on his jacket, but since it was acting as a nice deterrent, he kept it on show. Another barrier to keep the mortals at bay. He couldn't believe he had been reduced to using public transport. He eyed a few of the humans, issuing glares to the braver ones who looked as if they might chance it and sit beside him on the three-seater bench. Wretched creatures. The wall of calm cracked a little, and he drew in a deep breath. Mistake. His right ribs protested, a sharp pain echoing along them from the wound, worsening his mood and adding a few more cracks to the wall. He closed his eyes as the train pulled away, meaning to shut out the crowded carriage so he could claw back the calm, not meaning to fall asleep. He woke with a jolt as the train rounded a bend, and his black eyebrows pinched in a frown as he swept his blue gaze around the carriage. It was almost empty. Fuck, he muttered and peered out of the window, trying to see where he was as he silently berated himself for succumbing to sleep around so many humans. They weren't to be trusted. Fuck knew how many of them might have taken the opportunity to kill him if they had known what he was. Building after building whizzed past outside, none of them standing out to him. The damned city looked the same no matter where he went in it. He rubbed his tired eyes and squinted at the display screen above the doors. Broken. Just his luck. Had he missed his stop? He looked at the two people in his carriage, assessing them, and then squeezed his hand over his side as he leaned forwards and looked to his left, into the next one. 5 people in that one, none of them a threat. He leaned back into the padded seat. A shriek rose from his left. Esher edged forwards again and glared into the next carriage. A petite raven-haired female with bunches and a fringe that cut a straight line over her eyebrows swatted at a male with her black backpack. Her thick-soled patent leather shoes skidded on the floor of the car as she swung again, causing her short black dress to rise up and reveal the tops of her stripy black and white stockings. A little Lolita with a vicious streak. Or a terrified little Lolita. He canted his head, trying to figure out which one it was, and growing increasingly annoyed and disgusted with everyone in her carriage as they all pretended not to notice her plight. Chikan! Pervert. A public transport one in particular. The male grabbed her again, snapping his hand tight around her delicate wrist. Still no one moved to help her. Why the fuck was he forced to protect a people who cared nothing about their own kind? No hellspawn or god would tolerate this female's cries. She battered the male again, but the bastard pulled her towards him undeterred. Esher growled and shoved to his feet, not pausing to consider what he was about to do. He was going to save a human for the first time in his life. Chapter 2. Aiko swung with all her might, striking her assailant in the face this time. His breath left him in a rush, foul with the stench of alcohol and cigarettes. He swayed with the strike but remained upright and slurred something obscene at her. She tugged her arm, trying to twist free of his grip, her heart hammering against her chest, but he tightened his grip, squeezing her bones. She gritted her teeth against the pain. The only other man in the carriage looked in the opposite direction as she fought with the salaryman. Chikusho. Damn it. The door beyond the male slid open, and she froze as a handsome foreigner stepped through, his tall frame eating up the space. Black hair grazed his cheek, shorn short all around the sides but left long on top, swept forward so it almost obscured one of his eyes. Those ethereal blue eyes locked on her. She shivered, cold sweeping through her at the emptiness they contained. No trace of feeling. The salaryman tried to pull her towards him again. The newcomer strode towards her, his eyes turning stormy as he shifted them to the person manhandling her and closed the distance between them. In the blink of an eye, his right hand closed around the man's throat, and he was off her, slammed against the train door by the foreigner who stood at least 8 inches taller than him. The man leaned in close to the drunk, looked as if he wanted to say something as the salaryman began babbling in fear, and then eased back. She thought he might release the man. He pulled him away from the door and slammed him back against it with enough force that the man passed out and the entire carriage jolted. The foreigner huffed as he released the man and watched him slump to the floor and wiped his hand on his coat, as if the man had some sort of disease that he didn't want to get. When he turned towards her, those stormy blue eyes lowering to meet hers, she bent forwards and dropped her head. "Thank you," she said in English, hopeful that he would understand and would hear the true measure of her gratitude in her voice. It shook as she bowed several times, unable to stop herself as her adrenaline waned, and all the fear it had been holding at bay swept over her. He responded in perfect Japanese. "Don't ride alone so late at night, or at least use the women-only carriage." She wanted to tell him that the women-only carriage wasn't available on the last trains, but held her tongue, not wanting to appear ungrateful for his help. She nodded, rubbed the tears from her face with the back of her hand, and sniffed as she straightened. The man looked her over, his eyes revealing nothing to her. They settled on her hands as she clutched her backpack, and she tried to stop them from trembling, but no matter what she did, they kept shaking. "Are you all right?" he said in Japanese again, and she swore there was a flicker of concern in those words, even if it didn't show in his eyes. She nodded again. "Fine." The train eased to a halt and the door slid open, and relief crashed over her when she saw it was her stop. She stepped off the train, glaring at the sleeping salaryman as she passed, tempted to level a kick at him. When she looked back to thank the stranger again, he was stood on the platform beside her, his eyes dark as he stared at the man, looking as if he wanted to do more than just kick him. He huffed as he turned away, his motions stiff, as if he had to fight himself to do it, and muttered, "Fuck." Aiko followed his gaze to the station sign. The way he sighed had her eyes roaming back to him. He was at least 7 inches taller than her, and probably would have been closer to 10 above her 5'6" height if she hadn't been wearing her shoes. A black cotton coat that reached the ankles of his worn leather boots hugged his slender frame, tight to his chest but flared from his waist. The split down the front revealed blue jeans tucked into the tops of his army boots. He shifted back a step, placing more distance between them, and looked away from her, back in the direction the train had come. "Guess I'm walking." She had studied English in school and took classes at her university, so she knew enough to understand him and the implications of his words. He had missed his stop. "I could call you a cab," she managed, with only a few pauses to think of the right words. While she studied English, she didn't get to practice it much. Her parents didn't know it, and she only got to speak it with her classmates, and a lot of the time they only wanted to speak Japanese and were just learning English so they could put it on their resume. He shook his head, but he didn't look at her. She thought about going ahead and calling him a taxi anyway, her eyes drifting back down the height of him as she considered it. Her gaze stopped on his hand. Blood covered the side of it. "You're hurt," she said in English and pointed to his hand. He looked at it as if it was nothing and wasn't bothering him at all. Had he done it when helping her? "Shikusho," she muttered to herself, and thoughts of hailing him a cab were replaced by ones about returning the favor by helping him. It was risky, but she owed him, and she couldn't let him go without tending to the wound. She just hoped he knew enough Japanese to understand her. She pointed to his hand again. "My parents run a small clinic below our house. I can help with that." He regarded her with cold, assessing eyes, and she had the feeling he was the one who didn't trust her, as if she could hurt him. He was far more powerful than she was, and had proven it on the train. She wasn't a threat to him, so why did he look as if she might be? It was there in his eyes as she looked deeper into them, and she could feel it as she focused on him. Just a glimmer of a feeling, but it was there, hazy but clear enough that she could name the emotion. Part of him feared her. "I would like to help," she added softly, and he looked back down at his hand again, the black slashes of his eyebrows meeting hard above his darkening eyes. When he lifted them back to her, they were colder than before, and she moved back a step as a feeling went through her, one that warned her away from him. He glanced over his shoulder again and then back at the station sign. Sugamo. Which stop had he wanted? "Why would you trust me?" His deep voice rolled over her, his accent almost perfect. If she closed her eyes, she could easily fool herself into thinking she was talking to a Japanese man, not a foreigner. Where had he learned her language? He spoke it as if he had been doing it every day of his life. Had he been born in Japan? No, she could feel that he hadn't been born in this land, that he didn't really belong here. It was a sensation that he didn't fit or wasn't welcome, one that most people would put down to instinct, but that ran deeper in her blood. She studied his face as she answered him. "Why wouldn't I?" He frowned at her. "Because I could be trying to get into your tiny panties too." She doubted he wanted to do such a thing, the emotion she had detected in him pointing towards a desire to get away from her as quickly as possible, rather than get closer to her. Yet his words sent a thrill through her, followed by a heat that had her pulse picking up pace. "Come with me or don't. I won't force you." She turned away, slipped her arms into her black satin coffin-shaped backpack, and strode towards the exit. When she didn't feel him following, she resisted the temptation to look back. She had offered him help, extended a hand to him. It was down to him to take it. Aiko passed through the barriers and out onto the street. It was quiet, no cars moving along it, but she looked in both directions anyway before hurrying across to the other side. "How far is the clinic?" His voice arrested her steps, and she looked back at him where he stood in the entrance of the station, his left arm wrapped around him and the late spring breeze stirring the damp lengths of his black hair. "A mile." She pointed in the direction. His face darkened. She presumed it wasn't the distance irritating him, but the fact she had intended to walk a mile through the maze of streets alone in the early hours of morning. She did it all the time, and she wasn't the only woman in Tokyo who had the same habit. He looked as if he wanted to tell her to hail a cab for herself, and then said something, but she didn't catch the words, as she watched the emotions flitter across his handsome face, a kaleidoscope of them that moved so swiftly she couldn't take them all in. Fear was there, though. For himself still, or for her? Did he worry about her walking alone at night? Something akin to anguish crossed his face more than once, too, and that emotion was there in his eyes as he reluctantly crossed the road to her. What internal war did he wage? His question earlier had revealed more about himself than anything he had said or done so far. He found it difficult to trust, so he couldn't understand how others could do it so easily. She could trust him because if he had wanted to get into her tiny panties, he probably would have done it when they had been standing on the platform of the station for 10 minutes, not a soul in sight. He had stopped the pervert on the train, too, revealing a noble streak in his actions. "You'll probably get yourself killed if I let you go home alone," he muttered in English, and she understood enough to get the meaning of his words. He wasn't coming with her so she could look at his wound. He was walking her home because he wanted to protect her. She led him through the narrow streets, their steps loud on the wet road. It had stopped raining at some point, and she was thankful because she had left her umbrella on the train. She glanced at the man and found him looking at the clouds, his gaze distant and his head tipped back. His black hair grazed his temple, and she drank her fill of him, still finding it hard to believe she was walking with him to her home. Her grandmother would be proud of her. That feeling beat in her heart. She had taught Aiko to give aid to those who needed it, especially if they were from another place. This man certainly was. His blue eyes took on a troubled edge, and he slid them towards her, angling his head slightly in her direction so he could see her. She smiled and looked away, not wanting to upset him. When his gaze left her again, she snuck another glance at him. He was handsome, with fine black eyebrows and long inky lashes that framed his deep blue eyes, and a straight nose and softly curved lips that were a shade or two darker than his skin in the low light. Sculpted cheekbones were accented by long sideburns that reached the lobes of his ears and the sharp angle of his jaw. There was a coldness to his face, though, the lack of lines around his eyes and mouth, telling her that he rarely smiled or laughed. Why? When he frowned at her again, she looked away and kept her eyes off him this time, not wanting to upset him. His gaze moved away from her, but then came back to rest on her, and she kept hers fixed ahead of her, pretending not to notice the way he studied her. Because instinct warned he would react harshly if she made it clear she was aware of him staring. As they turned a corner onto her street and passed a small park, she swore he wanted to move closer to her, but he tensed and distanced himself instead, and his eyes left her. She looked at him, keeping her head forward so he wouldn't notice. His eyes scanned over the low buildings that lined the street, most of the windows dark. Aiko wanted to know his thoughts as he became absorbed in looking at everything but her, but held her tongue instead, not wanting to appear rude. She hadn't met many foreigners, and had certainly never met anyone like him. When she crossed the road, he followed, and when she stopped in front of one of the square modern buildings, he halted with her. As she pulled her backpack off, he stepped backwards and looked up the height of the two-story building. "Smaller than I thought." She slid the key into the lock on the glass door and twisted it.
"It's only a clinic. We have a few beds, but mostly Father treats local people and prescribes medicine."
She pushed the door open and walked into the dark room. Years of living in the cramped building allowing her to move through the pitch-black space without hitting anything. When she reached the door to the office, she reached inside and flicked on the light. She turned to tell the man to come in. He stood right behind her, his eyes stormy again as he looked around, his shoulders tensed as he scanned the darkness, as if he was expecting trouble.
"Father normally leaves this light on, but I prefer to turn it off when my parents are away."
She set her backpack down on the chair by the desk and pointed to the gurney.
"Have a seat."
The man eyed it with suspicion but moved past her and arranged himself on the padded bench. Aiko didn't fail to notice the way his lips twisted as he sat, or the way his left arm tightened on his ribs.
"Is it just your hand that's hurt?"
She edged closer to him. His eyes darkened a full shade, but around his pupils they seemed to grow brighter, turning cerulean. Not the lights. She changed course, heading towards the white cupboards instead of him, giving him a moment to forget her question. He was hurt, but he didn't want her seeing it, because he didn't trust her. Maybe it had been a mistake to insist on helping him. Aiko paused with her fingers on the metal handle of the top drawer. It didn't feel like a mistake, though. Helping him felt like the right thing to do. She had said she would take care of his hand, and that was what she would do. She owed him that much. She wouldn't press him to let her see his other injury or ask him how it happened, because now she felt sure it hadn't happened on the train. He had been injured before saving her, yet he had still stepped in to help her.
"My parents are away visiting family."
She opened the drawer as she rambled, filling the tense silence and giving him a clear sign that she wasn't going to press him for answers.
"I was going to go, but university is too busy right now."
She found the bandages and opened a fresh roll, and grabbed the scissors and tape, too. She placed them on the black seat beside him and found the cotton wool and saline solution, and a tray to place all the dirty items in when she was done with them. When she pulled a pair of disposable gloves from the box and tugged them on, he frowned at her. "You seem used to this." He nodded towards the items next to him when she looked at him. Aiko shrugged and removed her short black jacket, draping it over the back of the chair, and rolled up the sleeves of her dress.
I grew up in a clinic, and I'm studying medicine at university. Can you take your coat off for me?
He released his ribs and tugged the right sleeve of his coat up his forearm, making it clear he wasn't going to be removing the garment, because he didn't want her to see the wound he was trying to hide. She pushed the need to see it and tend to it to the back of her mind, and focused on the one he would let her see and treat. When she took a step towards him, he tensed and she flicked her eyes up to meet his. His were brighter, a sunny summer sky that deep inside she knew was a bad sign and not a good one. She kept still, watching the war rage in his eyes as his irises grew darker around the edges. She had never seen eyes like his, but then she had never met a man like him. When his eyes settled and he released the breath he had been holding, she risked moving. He didn't tense again as she approached him, keeping her eyes off him to give him time to calm himself. His voice was gravelly when he spoke. "Is university the reason you were out so late?" He was trying to fill the silence now, to take his mind off what she was doing, and she went along with it, wanting him to be as comfortable as possible. She soaked some of the cotton wool in the saline solution on one side of the tray, and then slowly turned towards him. As she reached for the makeshift bandage he had wrapped around the wound, she answered him so he would have something to focus on other than what her hands were doing.
I had work tonight, and afterwards I met my friends at Shibuya. I meant to be home earlier than this, but it's so easy to lose track of time.
She drew the white handkerchief away from his arm, and her eyebrows briefly knit as she looked down and spotted a tattoo peeking out of the blood on his wrist, just above a thin black bracelet that sat flush against his skin. He noticed where she was looking and tensed, and she swore he was waiting for her to mention it as she turned and placed the soiled cloth on the tray. It had surprised her, but she wasn't one to hold with the traditional view of tattoos. She doubted he was Yakuza. Aiko focused on her work, carefully wiping the blood on his arm and hand away with the saline solution until she could see the wound, a 3-inch-long gash that ran at a diagonal across his forearm a few inches above his wrist, and his tattoo, a beautiful dark blue trident on the inside of his wrist. "You shouldn't be out so late at night," he muttered as she dabbed the gash with the solution, making sure it was completely cleaned. Clearly, he shouldn't be out so late at night either. It meant bad things for both of them, but at least she hadn't ended up with what looked like a knife wound. He must have been in a fight. Under the bright light of the inspection lamp, she had spotted more cuts on his neck and a few on his face. Plus, there was the one he didn't want her to know about. How deep was that wound? She risked a glance at his right side as she turned to toss the used cotton wool on the tray and reached for the bandages. His black coat was wet from the rain, making it impossible for her to judge how much blood he had lost. She frowned as she spotted a single tear in it, barely an inch long. A stab wound. He needed treatment, and she wanted to give it to him, but she kept her tongue in check and didn't mention it. The wound on his arm must have been from the same fight, and it was already sealed and healing. The one he was hiding might be healing just as rapidly, which only made the feeling she had grew stronger. He hadn't come with her for treatment. He had come with her to ensure she reached her home safely.
This looks good.
She carefully wrapped the bandages around his arm.
It should heal nicely. Hold this.
He placed his fingers on the end of the bandage where hers had been. She picked up the scissors and cut the ribbon of cream material, and then grabbed the tape and snipped off 2 long pieces. She placed one just below his fingers, brushing them. He snatched his hand away as if she had burned him. Aiko pretended not to notice that, too, or his sharp intake of breath and the way his eyes drilled into her, and that feeling rose again, warning her to move away from him. She refused and placed the second piece of tape and smoothed them both down carefully. Her fingers slowed as she looked at his arm. Silvery scars spiraled around his forearm, from halfway down to his wrist. She reached out to touch one. He shoved the sleeve of his coat down, stealing them from view, and she jumped, her entire body tensing as she quickly drew her hand to her chest. Words warred on her lips and in her heart, an apology battling a desire to question him, to know what sort of life he led to have such deep scars, to end up wounded and act as if it was nothing. "Thanks," he muttered, the word hollow and devoid of the emotion that normally accompanied it.
Would you like some tea?
He was off the gurney before she could even finish that question, his long black coat swirling around his legs as he strode from the office. "I should go." He was in the doorway of the clinic by the time she left the office, his figure nothing more than a silhouette in the light coming in from the street. He looked back at her. "But thank you." He was gone. Aiko stared at the doorway for a heartbeat and then hurried forwards, but there was no sign of him in the street. It was as if he had simply disappeared. It wouldn't surprise her if he had. His words rang in her head, his deep voice a soothing sound as she replayed them, focusing on the last three. A thank you that had been genuine. He had reluctantly thanked her for tending to his wound, but then she had offered him tea and he had thanked her from the heart? Or was that thank you for something else? She closed her eyes and relived that moment and the way he had looked at her, the way his blue eyes had glowed in the slim light. It struck her that he hadn't been thanking her for the offer of tea. He had been thanking her for not breaking his trust, for not hurting him. Aiko tipped her head back and watched the patchy clouds racing across the inky sky, revealing hints of stars between them. Strange man. If she could call him a man. Chapter 3. Esher stood near the outside wall of the main room of the mansion, the tatami mats warm beneath his bare feet, the slight roughness of them soothing as he listened to his eldest brother, Karis, drone on about the latest intel they had managed to gather on demon movements. He picked at the bandage around his right arm as his brothers began to file their reports, and Merrick made dry comments as he noted them all down on his laptop from his perch in the cream armchair that stood to Escher's right and completed the rough semicircle of seating around the TV in the corner beside him. Karis sat on the couch opposite Esher, their youngest brother Callistos shifting to his left to give him room. They were a contrast, Karis's black hair the darkness to Callistos' blonde light. Where Karis was neat and orderly, his hair kept short and immaculate, and his tailored black dress shirt and slacks pressed, and even his black socks perfect. Cal looked like the tempest he was, his fair hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, and a worn khaki t-shirt that had more than one hole in it hugging his chest, and faded black fatigues encasing the long legs he stretched in front of him, resting his feet on the coffee table. Cal's blue eyes flicked towards the TV to Escher's right, and he could almost see his brother itching to grab one of the controllers and fire up the console to knock out a few rounds of one of the first-person shooters in his collection. Cal hated them treating him like a kid because he was the youngest, but he acted every second of the 107-year age gap between them. Fuck, it was better than being 70 years Escher's junior and acting twice his age like Diamond, though. More than once, Diamond had remarked that he felt like the older brother to Escher and not the other way around. Diamond was just lucky that he loved him most out of his 6 brothers. Otherwise, he might have been inclined to take him up on those fighting words, like their older brother Ares did whenever Diamond threw barbs at him. Fire and ice. Escher didn't miss the days of them brawling in the underworld. He'd had quite enough of coming close to being flambéed or frozen. Diamond scrubbed a black-gloved hand over his frosty white hair, his blue eyes cautious as he gave his report to Mark. "Speed up," Valen muttered from the couch nearest Escher. He toyed with a knife, flipping it end over end, his impatience showing. "This is taking too long." His blue eyes fixed Karis with a glare when their oldest brother looked at him and sighed. "You'd complain too if you had a woman waiting for you." Valen flashed a grin at Karis, who only sighed again and rolled his green eyes. "It's bad enough I have to hear complaints from him." Karis jerked his chin towards Ares, where he sat beside Valen. The brunette had a death grip on his knees, his knuckles white as his fingertips pressed into his black jeans, and his warm brown eyes flickering with amber sparks. Tension radiated from him, his broad-muscled shoulders tensed beneath his black t-shirt, and Escher knew the source of it. Megan. His older brother wanted to return to his female, just as Valen wanted to return to Ava. Esher had denied them entrance the last time his brothers had tried to bring them to the mansion. With the wound the wraith had given him still healing, he couldn't stand having the mortals present in his home. Ares had understood and complied immediately, taking Megan back to his apartment in New York to wait for him. Valen had kicked up a fuss. When Esher had threatened to butcher the human assassin, spelling out the exact reason he didn't want her near him, and Karis had been forced to restrain him, his brother had backed down and taken her away, and refused to attend the meeting. Esher wasn't sure he should be grateful for his attendance this time. It had taken him 5 minutes to start complaining. He brought up the female at every opportunity, making it clear she had been working with him to protect the gate, as if that would curry any favor with Esher. It only made him want to kill her even more. Mortals had no place being near the gates, so close to his home. Valen pushed his fingers through the overlong top of his blonde hair, brushing it down over the right side of his face, so it almost concealed it from Esher's view. While Esher's haircut was similar, with short sides and back, and the long lengths on top swept forwards, the hair on the sides of Valen's head had been crudely cut, and it was longer on top, reaching his jaw. He folded his arms across his chest, causing his biceps to tighten against the sleeves of his black t-shirt, and grumbled to himself about Ava. Mortals had no place in this house. Esher teased another thread free of the bandage around his right arm as he stared through the opening between the wood-framed white paper panels across the room to his left. Sunlight played across the garden and the wing of the Edo period mansion beyond it, where more paper panels closed off the rooms from the covered wooden walkway that ran around the 3 sides of the horseshoe-shaped building. It reflected off the ribbed gray-tiled roof that swept downwards and chased over the manicured bushes that dotted the small courtyard garden. A few pebbles of the gravel beneath them were out of place, and one was resting on a stepping stone. One of his brothers had been walking out there. His brows drew down as he charted a series of footprints, his fingers fraying the end of the bandage. He would have to go out with the rake when his brothers were gone. The topiary had a few pine needles out of place, too, and perhaps he could enjoy the cherry trees blooming in the larger garden beyond the pond while he fed the koi and soaked up the silence. "Esher?" Diamond's voice cut into the peaceful image building in his head, shattering it, and he looked at his younger brother, his frown sticking. "You all right?" He nodded and looked around at his other brothers. They were all staring at him as if he had 2 heads, or was about to rampage through Tokyo. "Someone walked on the gravel." Esher drew down a deep breath to calm himself, reining in the urges they had all spotted in his eyes, and probably in the favor mark on his wrist, too, judging by the way Diamond was looking at it. Esher looked down, but the trident above his black bracelet that matched the ones his brothers wore on their wrists was a steady pale blue, not giving his feelings away. He followed Diamond's gaze again and realized his brother wasn't looking at his wrist. He was looking at the bandage around his arm, a bandage Esher had been playing with. He still couldn't believe he had gone with the human, or that he hadn't wanted to kill her when she had been tending the wound, or that he couldn't get his mind off her. It had been 3 days since they had met, and he kept thinking about her, kept replaying small moments of his time with her. Only 80% of the time an urge to harm her rose inside him. The other 19%, he wasn't sure how he felt then. And the remaining 1% was reserved for a thought that had left him cold and confused. He wanted to see her again. He had ruthlessly shoved that desire out of his head and his heart, banishing it. It wasn't going to happen. She was human, untrustworthy, dangerous, a wretch. So why did he despise himself whenever he thought of her like that? Why did he feel as if he was the one who couldn't be trusted, the one who was dangerous, a wretched beast? "Esher?" Ares this time. Esher's gaze snapped down to him. "You sure you're all right, man?" Ares looked him over, not at all bothered by the glare he leveled at him. "You seem a little more tense than usual." "Demons attacked the gate. I was injured. And a mortal might have—" He couldn't finish that sentence. Kara sighed. "You killed someone." It wasn't what he had meant to say. He had been teetering on the brink of bringing up the female, a desire to understand the conflict she caused in him, almost convincing him to share her with his brothers. But then the thought of telling them anything about her had slammed his mouth shut. He didn't want to share her with anyone. He shrugged. He saw the demons in me fighting. A reasonable excuse. You could have wiped his memory, Marek volunteered, his tone distant as he typed on the keyboard of the silver laptop, his brown eyes on the screen. No, he couldn't have. Wiping memories was a talent they all possessed, but to do it, he would have had to touch the human, which meant the male would have met the same end. Touching humans was a definite no. You forget who you're talking to? Callistos offered with a grin in his voice, and Marek looked up from his computer, regarded Esher with a look that said he might have, but he knew now what a mistake the suggestion had been and went back to his work. He had touched the pervert on the train, and he had wanted to kill him too. He still wasn't sure how he had managed to rein in that desire and claw back enough control to stop himself. What about the mortal female? Had he touched her? She had touched him. 99% of the time he hadn't found it repulsive, or grounds to make her blood explode. The remaining 1%? He recalled her fingers had brushed his, and an electric jolt had lit him up inside, like Valen had just pumped 50,000 volts into him for a laugh, only it hadn't been unpleasant. He shook her out of his head and focused back on the room, because Diamond was intently staring at the bandage now, and looking as if he was going to mention it. Again. Diamond mentioned it whenever he visited. Esher had refused to answer every question or suggestion. Demons attacked my gate that night, too, Diamond offered in a slow, measured way that made it clear to Esher that he was still debating mentioning the bandage again, pressing him for answers he didn't want to give. How many nights ago? Valen looked from Diamond to him, his blue eyes bright with curiosity. 3. And Esher had gone over it from every angle. It just felt like a regular attempt on the gate. But now Diamond had mentioned an attack in Hong Kong at the same time. Karras exhaled a curse, which was never a good sign. Shit. Paris and London were hit that night, too. I went straight from Paris to help Cal in London. Marek finally looked up from his laptop. Seville had a couple of visitors. Nothing I couldn't handle, though. I hardly broke a sweat. Everyone looked at Ares. His second eldest brother was a wall of tensed muscle as he sat on the couch with fire in his eyes, the air around him shimmering like a heat haze as his face darkened. 5 hit the gate, he growled, the flames in his irises burning brighter, and then said what was on everyone's mind. It was a coordinated attempt. They're testing us. They must have hit the Tokyo and Hong Kong gates at the same time to keep us both busy. Diamond curled his fingers into fists, causing his black leather gloves to creak as frost glittered on them, a sign that Ares wasn't the only one losing his temper as he considered the implications. Paris and London were hit in the early hours of morning. It would have been dark still in Rome, New York, and Seville. Karras leaned forwards and rested his elbows on his knees, his black shirt blending into his equally dark slacks, and his fine jet eyebrows dipped low above emerald eyes that glowed a shade brighter than normal. Really not a good sign. It wasn't like their fearless leader to let anything get to him. A coordinated attack by demons wasn't a threat. Demons were weak. They could handle them. It certainly wasn't a threat to Karras. His brother could have stepped to every gate and dealt with all the demons at each one in the blink of an eye. Marek lifted his head again, his warm brown eyes reflecting his concern as he studied their brother. Diamond exchanged a look with Cal, and Cal casually leaned back into the couch, splaying his arms along the top of it, where Karras couldn't see him, and shrugged, his expression shifting to show he wasn't sure what was up with Karras. Valen moved, crossing his legs so his black fatigues stretched tight over his left knee, and slowly dipped his hand into his pocket and eased his phone out of it. Esher frowned as he rifled through the charms dangling from it, his actions slow and careful, so Karras didn't notice. Valen's thumb stopped on a familiar silver sword and shield, and he pressed it into his palm. Calling for backup? Karras wouldn't appreciate it. Esher had half a mind to tell his younger brother not to meddle, but something was wrong, and the need to take care of his family had him holding his tongue and hoping she would answer. All of them had noticed that Karras hadn't been the same since leaving the underworld, since leaving her. You think testing us has something to do with whoever is behind sending the stronger demons to attack us? Valen slipped his phone back into his pocket. Just the mention of their enemy was enough to have the raging tide that Esher had been fighting to hold back for the past few weeks, rising again inside him, surging through his veins and flooding his mind with a dark need, a hunger to hunt. "Rein it in," Diamond said softly, a bare whisper that curled around him and pushed back against the tide. "We are all safe. Everything is good here, remember?" Esher nodded slowly. But everything wasn't good. His left side ached, cold with the memory of what the Wraith had done to him, and how close he had come to something worse than death, and how their beloved little sister had suffered that same fate. "Give your sister my regards." Valen had filled him in on his theory when Esher had regained consciousness days after the attack. Days. He was still healing from the wound, too, and it had been weeks now. Would it always bother him? Would he always bear this reminder that he had almost lost his soul and owed a human his life? He had enough scars to deal with, enough pain to last an eternity without this adding to it. He rubbed at his side, his lips compressing as he gritted his teeth, and anger surged again. A need to lash out and fight, to hunt down the Wraith who had done this to him and make him pay for it, and for Calendria's deathless state. Valen had broken it to him as gently as possible, but the idea that Calendria's soul was missing, sucked from her by that fiend, and was still lost now, centuries later, had sent him into a rage so dark and consuming that Karis and Diamond had been forced to shut him in the cage. Esher shuddered as he closed his eyes and gripped his side, holding himself. Gods, he despised the cage. He hated feeling trapped and helpless, stripped of his ability to teleport and forced to endure confinement. For the sake of the fucking humans. It was their fault he couldn't bear it. They should be the ones to suffer when he lost his fight against his other self. They should be the ones to suffer when the lunar perigee hit, not him. But he was the one locked away, bound just when the pull of the moon made him strongest, unleashed all the fury he struggled to hold inside him every damned day, for the sake of a race who didn't deserve it. Esher! Diamond's palms hovered close to his face, framing it as best he could without touching him. Escher's cheeks chilled anyway, just being close to Diamond enough to sap his heat. It was a bane both Diamond and Ares had to bear. Their powers had manifested in the mortal world, their ice and fire making them dangerous to touch. "I want to kill him," Esher growled and pushed away from his brother. He paced a few feet across the open space between the TV area and the dining area, and then pivoted on his heel to face his brothers again. "He deserves to die. I want him dead. I need him dead. He should suffer for what he did." He shoved the flat of his palm against his chest and dug his fingertips into his dark gray shirt. "I can't settle until he's paid for what he did, or until she comes. We all want to kill him, brother, but we need information first, remember?" Ares' careful words as he stood and moved to face him had Escher's gaze flicking to Cal, a brief glance that he hoped their youngest brother didn't notice. Cal didn't know that the Wraith had been responsible for what had happened to Calendria, and his brothers were right to keep him in the dark. He couldn't know. Not yet. Not until they knew whether they could retrieve her soul or not. It would send him over the edge. Esher huffed and paced across the tatami mats to the opened panels opposite the entrance, and stared into the garden, trying to find peace there even when he knew he wouldn't. There was only one path to peace for him now. Hunt the Wraith. Once the Wraith was dead, and whoever was due to come after him finally made her appearance, he would find peace. He needed to get it over with, needed to send them screaming into a black eternity of suffering, into a hell of his own making. He would put their damned souls in the vilest, most horrific place imaginable, condemning them to rot there forever. Esher scrubbed his hand over his side, wrapped his arms around his stomach, and toyed with the bandage on his forearm again, as a feeling went through him, one that had been bothering him since he had come around after the Wraith attack. Cal wasn't the only person his brothers were keeping in the dark. There was something they weren't telling him, too, and it unsettled him, kept him on the edge, and made it difficult to retain control. It pissed him off, too, even when part of him knew that if they were keeping a secret from him, it was probably for a good reason. He tried to listen to his brothers as they discussed everything Valen had learned from the two demons who had attacked him, an incubus and his succubus sister. Ares mentioned the demon who had attacked him, one who had stolen his power. Both events had brought the Wraith out of hiding. Maybe when the female due to come for him finally attacked, the Wraith would make an appearance again. Esher would be ready for him. Chapter 4. Esher tuned his brothers out as he sank into the glorious vision building in his mind, one where he overcame the Wraith and captured him, not for information as Karis would want, but for the sheer pleasure of revenge. He would bind and torture the wretch until he broke and confessed what he had done with Calendria's soul, and then he would send him screaming into the darkest pit in the underworld, and would inform their father about what the wretch had done. Gods, Hades would see to it the bastard suffered eternally. His lips twisted in a slow smile. Fuck, he would beg his father to give him a front-row seat for that show. A dark voice whispered in his mind, seductive words that tempted him to listen to them, coaxed him into ignoring his brother's wishes and obeying the gnawing hunger inside him, the need to hunt. He wavered as the city beyond the garden flickered to the other world, the future of Earth should he and his brothers fail to stop the calamity the Moirai had foreseen, a calamity their new enemy intended to bring about by doing something to the gates, a calamity part of Esher wanted to see, the darker part, the part that had been born centuries ago and had whispered to him ever since, rising to steal control at times when he wasn't strong enough to hold it at bay. A beast he fought to keep locked inside him, a monster he had failed to contain more than once. It had been hard enough to fight it when the only threat to his family had been the demons and the humans, but it was growing impossible now that he knew the Wraith had been responsible for Calendria's end. His war with it was constant, and he wasn't sure he could win. He needed to avenge his sister. His eyes narrowed on the flames that spiraled high into the black sky beyond the pristine white wall of the mansion grounds, sparks dancing like golden fireflies as the wind caught them, looking as if they were rising on the screams of the mortals whose flesh burned and the shrieks of the creatures who hunted and preyed on them. A shudder racked him, a shiver of pleasure that rolled through him as their screams surrounded him, creating a symphony that tugged at the darkness in him, made him yearn to make this future real so he could bask in the glory of it. Esher! The male voice intruded, shaking the vision of beauty before him. He snarled, launched his left hand out and wrapped it around the offender's neck, squeezing it hard. The male growled and countered him, and icy cold gripped his throat, burned like fire as it swept over him beneath his clothes. Get a fucking grip! Diamond snarled and shoved hard, sending him staggering backwards onto the raised wooden walkway that enclosed three sides of the smaller courtyard garden, and shaking Esher's grip on him. His back slammed into one of the thick square pillars that supported the overhanging roof. His breath exploded from him as the timber cracked. The sound of dropping water had his head snapping to his right, in time to catch a glimpse of brightly colored koi suspended in the air for a moment before they dropped back into the pond. Fuck, Esher muttered and got a grip on himself, pushing out the damned voice that still taunted him, told him to take pleasure in the destruction he wrought, not to be ashamed of it, tempted him with thoughts of heading beyond the protective walls of the mansion to the city and unleashing the fury he had bottled inside him on the weak creatures who inhabited it. It would be glorious. No. He grasped the sides of his head and squeezed until it hurt. No! He didn't really want that. He was just tired and weak from the Wraith's attack, worn down and vulnerable. Yes, vulnerable. He was too susceptible right now, not strong enough to shut out the damned voice and the things it wanted him to do. Listen to me, Esher, Diamond whispered, and he focused on his brother, using the sound of his voice to shut out the darker one, just as they had practiced. You're all good. Everything is fine. Everyone is fine. But they weren't. He saw that as he lifted his head and spotted the unmistakable trace of red beneath his brother's nose, where Diamond hadn't quite managed to wipe all the blood away to hide it from him, and the dark bruises emerging around his throat just above the collar of his navy turtleneck. I'm sorry, Esher murmured, pain closing his throat as he considered what he had done. He had hurt the ones he loved, the ones he had vowed to protect. The only ones who mattered. I'm fine. Diamond managed to smile and rubbed at his throat. No harm done. A lie. He noticed the way Diamond's fingers trembled as he neatened his spiked white hair, acting casual when he was shaken. Esher averted his gaze, but the pain and guilt lingered as he looked at the pond and the koi that were flapping around on the gravel surrounding it. He stepped off the walkway, crossing the pebbles without feeling them biting into the soles of his feet, and stooped to carefully pick up the fish and place them gently back into the pond. He breathed easier as he counted them all, checking each one in turn, and saw none of them had been hurt. His brothers' voices filled the silence behind him as he watched the fish, their words distant and lost on him, and he sensed them departing one by one, until only Diamond remained. Had he harmed any more of his brothers? Gods, he hoped he hadn't. It was getting harder to control himself. His rage should have been directed solely at the demons and the humans, not at his family. His family were the only ones who mattered. The underworld was the only place that mattered, too. The world could burn for all he cared. But if it burned, then the underworld burned with it. He watched a black and white koi he was particularly fond of, one he'd had for decades, swim past to join the group waiting near the walkway, where it jutted out over the pond to his right by his quarters. An ache started behind his breast, one that was familiar to him. He wanted to return to the underworld. He couldn't handle things here anymore. Today was proof of that. He wasn't strong enough to hold back the darker part of himself that viewed all the mortals as a threat to him, and his family, and his world. Just thinking about hunting them, watching them suffer, had been enough to have him slipping. Hurting the ones he loved. You all right? Diamond eased into a crouch beside him, his long black coat pooling around his feet on the pale gravel. Sorry. He kept his eyes on the fish, shame eating at him as he thought about what he had done. Diamond had given as good as he had got. Esher's throat was sore, and it stung a little to breathe and speak, but the pain didn't make him feel better about what he had done. The moon is just fucking with you. It's almost full. Diamond ghosted a hand over his shoulder. Esher wished he would touch him, because he needed to feel it, needed someone to hold him together right now because he felt as if he was falling apart. He focused on the moon, picturing it in an attempt to soothe himself. It was distant from him, on the other side of the planet. He wanted to see it, needed to see it. He needed the calming influence it had on him. He forced himself to remain where he was, though, because stepping that distance would drain some of his strength, and he had to remain strong in case the attack came tonight. He rested his elbows on his knees as he remained crouched on the gravel at the edge of the pond, his eyes on the fish as they all slowly grouped before him, clearly having decided he was going to feed them from this spot instead. They were beautiful as they glided around, the pattern of their colors constantly shifting. His left fingers drifted across to his right arm as the sight of them soothed him, calming the turbulent waters in his soul. The sensation of calm grew stronger still. Any injury you had would be healed by now. Diamond's careful words, softly spoken, floated through his mind, and he looked down to find he was playing with the bandage again. His brother's pale blue eyes lifted from his arm to rest on his face. Why are you so reluctant to discard it? Did a demon get you? Are you infected somehow? Esher opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He stepped rather than answering him, appearing briefly at the front porch of the mansion to grab his long black coat and jam his feet into his leather boots, and then teleporting again. The guilt over hurting his brother mingled with new shame as he landed on top of the covered footbridge that spanned the gap between two large buildings, allowing humans to come and go between them above the busy road that cut a path straight ahead of him and intersected with an equally as crowded road just 200 meters from him in the heart of the Shibuya district. Why couldn't he just tell his brother what had happened? He was closest to Diamond, and they had shared everything in the past, leaving nothing unsaid between them. So why did he want to keep the female a secret? Esher looked back in the direction of the mansion and sighed as the breeze blew the longer lengths of his black hair back from his face. He wasn't sure what was wrong with him, and he had no reason to keep secrets from Diamond. If he kept on like this, he would only cause his brother more worry, and he didn't want that. The next time Diamond asked him, he would tell him. The female was nothing to him anyway, just another human in a world filled with them. He couldn't trust her. She was dangerous, a wretch. If she knew what he was, she would react in the way humans always did, their fear of whatever was stronger than they were driving them to attack and kill it. She would. He looked down at the swarm of humans below him as they crossed the juncture between the four roads, hurrying from the station to his right or towards it. If they knew what he was, they wouldn't understand. They wouldn't even try to. They would hurt him. They would harm his family. The black urge to hurt them first rose inside him, but he pulled the earbuds from his shirt pocket, stuffed them into his ears, and flicked through the classical music on his iPod until he found a soothing peace. As soon as the piano and strings filled his ears, the volume loud enough to shut out the incessant noise of the mortal world, the tension drained from him and his shoulders relaxed. Evening light, beautiful and rich amber, washed over the side of the high building in front of him on the other side of the crossing, turning the huge television screen mounted on it dull, and caught on the towering ones to his right. He stood at the edge of the roof of the bridge, soaking up the music, letting it calm him as he watched the mortals, and debated heading down. He was testing himself again, just as he had been that night when he had stood in this same spot. That night the moon had been full, pulling at him and weakening his resistance to the darker side of himself. That night Valen had brought a mortal female, the assassin Ava, to the mansion, wanting to protect her from their uncle and their enemies. That night his guard had dropped, and the wraith had attacked him, plunging a tainted blade into his side. And that night a mortal had saved his soul. Megan. Ares' female had the power to heal, but it was a power that drained her when she used it on a god like him and his brothers, pushing her close to death. She had risked it to save him. Fuck. He still didn't know how to process that. It haunted him. He owed his life to a mortal. Diamond wanted him to talk about it, and so did his other brothers, but he needed time. Space. Esher looked down at the mortals, the warm spring breeze toying with his long coat, making it flap around his boots. To think he owed one of them his life. His left hand covered the sleeve of his black coat over the bandage on his right forearm, as a feeling went through him, a need that had haunted him from the moment he had stepped away from that small clinic in the northern suburb of Tokyo. An urge to return there. He crushed it. She meant nothing, was nothing. He was just confused, conflicted by what Megan had done for him. That was the only reason he had lowered his guard around another of her kind. Esher closed his eyes and focused on the music, shutting the world around him out. He would go to Lion, one of his favorite cafes in Tokyo, and one that was a sanctuary for him. He would sit there, as he always did, in a quiet corner, listening to the classical music they played and finding peace in that place his brothers had agreed was his, one where Diamond rarely dared to bother him, and one where he could think. A strange tingling swept through him. Not a demon. Their presence made his gut swirl with a sickening sensation, and it was still light out. They would be in hiding for another few hours yet. This was different. He tilted his head to his right and opened his eyes, locking them on the source of it. She shifted foot to foot far below him, her back to the statue of Hachiko, a faithful dog, where people often met, facing the exit of the train station. Her obsidian long hair had been twirled into twin buns at the back of her head, and a pink and black checkered bag bumped the front of her thighs, as she anxiously swayed side to side, trying to see through the crowd. There was a pause, and then she lifted her arm as she tiptoed, waving to someone. Esher almost growled as he sought the human she was signaling, but it died on his lips as he spotted a female waving back at her. The reaction had him taking a step back, that confusion rising again as he struggled to understand why the thought of her potentially meeting a male had pushed him close to stepping down and dealing with them before they could reach her. Her friend eased through the crowd, and when they embraced, his mortal's violet fluffy jumper rode up to flash a strip of pale-toned skin. He growled now, and eyed all the males in the vicinity, ensuring none of them had noticed. Satisfied that they hadn't, he looked back at her, and frowned. She was gone. Damn it. Esher stepped before he had even considered doing it, appearing near the trees that encased the statue on one side, his eyes scouring the busy square for her. He found her near the crossing, speaking with two females now, both of them with hair that barely reached their jaws and dark makeup around their eyes and a smear of red on their lips. They smiled and laughed, but all he felt was disgust and a need to wipe them from the face of the earth. His female, however, she was as cute as he recalled, although today she wore more conservative clothing of black jeans and thick-soled purple shoes with her violet jumper, and her bag was plain in comparison to the satin coffin-shaped one that had the winged cat toy dangling from the zipper. Cute? He stilled right down to his breathing as that word came back to slap him. No, she wasn't cute. She was... The darker part of himself volunteered the word vile. Beautiful. Beautiful despite the fact she wore only light makeup, or possibly even none. Beautiful despite the fact she was a human. As beautiful and as full of life as a butterfly as she moved with her comrades, flitting in front of them one moment with a smile on her face, and beside them the next, her mouth parted on a laugh that filled her whole face with joy. Esher trailed after her, ignoring the feeble humans as he pushed through the crowd, struggling to keep up with her and keep his distance at the same time. Fuck. He felt like a damned stalker as he followed her down the narrow, cobbled pedestrian street that branched off at a diagonal to the left of his favorite Starbucks, unable to take his eyes off her even when he knew he should walk away right now and forget about her. He couldn't. He swore she laughed every time she spoke, and every time her friend said something, oblivious to the way she drew the attention of those around her, the males in particular. Esher made a mental note to kill them later, once he had drunk his fill of the fascinating little human. He had never noticed that humans could be like her, buzzing with goodness, kindness. He rebelled against that word, his mind hurling 1,000 images that contradicted it and reminded him that humans were incapable of kindness. They were vicious, untrustworthy, dangerous. They would kill him if he revealed what he was to them, just as their ancestors had tried. He slowed to a halt, his gaze still following her as his body locked up tight, the pain thrumming in his heart, bleeding over into his muscles and making them clamp down on his bones, as a need to lash out grew inside him. He couldn't trust her. She was weak, but a threat, dangerous to him. But for the first time, he felt as if the danger he was in wasn't physical. It was emotional. She was weak, but gods, she could crush him. He was aware of that as he watched her twirl and smile, her eyes bright with her laughter, and he felt a pull towards her, one that rivaled that of the moon. He couldn't trust her. She was mortal, and all mortals wanted to do was hurt him. If he trusted her, in time she would prove herself just like the others. She would wound him, try to break him, and gods, she might just succeed where others had failed and end up destroying him. The crowd closed in around him, and his muscles cranked tighter, his heart pounding faster as his tension rose, the need to lash out growing fiercer with each passing second, until he teetered on the brink of showing her and all the other mortals that they were in the presence of something not of their world. A god. Paint the streets crimson. Tear the world down. Kill them all. Before they can kill me. Esher staggered back a step, shoving away from that voice that rose from the pit inside him, refusing to succumb to it, because if he lost control, if he allowed the other side of himself to emerge, he would hurt her too. He wouldn't care that he knew her, or that she was gentle and for all he knew would probably never hurt him. He would kill her just as easily as he killed the others. He broke away from her and started walking, his pace increasing as he shoved through the crowd and struggled to focus on his destination, one far from her. In the split second between locking in a destination and teleporting, her eyes landed on him. He felt it as a hot caress, one that had his blood boiling with need that demanded he stay and sate it. A need that shook him. It wasn't born of a desire to destroy or to shed blood. It was born of a desire to touch, to risk everything in order to feel something. A feeling that crystallized inside him as he landed on a rooftop a short distance from the cafe and made everything he had been going through the past few days make a dreadful sort of sense. He needed her, but he couldn't have her, because he couldn't trust himself. He was dangerous, a beast, a monster who would crush such a delicate butterfly. Chapter 5. Aiko slowed to a halt as awareness washed through her, a sensation that she was being watched. She turned on the busy shopping street in Shibuya and looked around.
What's wrong?
Kumiko moved closer to her, and Aiko sensed her concern as the distance between them narrowed. Megumi didn't seem at all bothered as she watched a man a little older than her walking past, heading towards the crossing and the station. Aiko knew he was here. She could feel him. She moved to the side of the street, gripped the pole of the lamp, and tiptoed, trying to see above the heads of the crowd. She scanned them, a sense of desperation growing inside her as she failed to find him. He was here. She was sure of it. She swept her eyes back over the crowd, might have caught a glimpse of his wild black hair and the gray-blue scarf he had been wearing the night they had met, the night he had saved her. She had been thinking about him ever since, struggling to focus on her studies and her part-time job. Even her friends had noticed her spacing out and had started teasing her about it.
Seriously, what's wrong?
Kumiko tugged her arm, pulling her down from the lamppost. Aiko forced her gaze away from the other end of the street and shook her head.
I just thought I saw someone I knew.
Megumi giggled.
A man?
No. Aiko waved her hand in front of her face and tasted the lie on her tongue. There was no way she was going to talk to Kumiko or Megumi about men. They were friends, but they weren't that close. They were in the same class at the University of Tokyo and had grouped up during the week they had started there. But their backgrounds were very different, and sometimes she felt it keenly. Kumiko and Megumi came from rich families and had grown up together in a prestigious area of Tokyo, and she had grown up in a rundown suburb in a family that had often struggled to make ends meet. They were learning medicine because their families had decided upon it, neither of them really interested in having a profession at all, happy to live off their family's money. Aiko was studying medicine so she could help out at her family's clinic. They couldn't have come from more polar worlds. They couldn't have been more different in personality either. Megumi made that abundantly clear as she grabbed her and Kumiko and pulled them towards the next street.
Come on, I want to go this way.
Aiko didn't want to go that way, but she didn't say anything as Megumi dragged her along and Kumiko joined in, smiling from ear to ear as she talked about how she was going to get the host boys that always loitered on that street to flirt with her. They were men who made a living by being paid to drink with women in the host club, entertaining them for an evening, as if they were the woman's boyfriend. She had heard rumors that some of the men even took things further. Both Megumi and Kumiko were open with relationships, and had told Aiko about several of the ones they had indulged in after joining university, many of them with older men, but most of them with men in other classes. When Aiko had found the courage to ask how long they had been sleeping with men, Megumi had confessed she had slept with a partner of her father's when she was 14, and Kumiko had given herself to the son of a wealthy neighbor at a party when she had been 16. No, they couldn't have been more different. But Aiko still loved spending time with them, even when she had no experience of many of the things they talked about: grand parties, lavish lifestyles, and expensive holidays, and men. She looked back the way they had come. How had he gotten the scars on his arms? They had looked as if he had been bound and had struggled. She had seen similar wounds on someone almost a decade ago, when she had been in high school and helping her father out over the summer. The woman had been brought to her family's clinic for rehabilitation after police had rescued her from a man who had kept her tied up and done terrible things to her. Had he been tied up like that, held captive against his will? Aiko was so lost in thoughts of him that she didn't notice the host boys flirting with her, until one was so close to her that his breath washed across her face and the heat of his body brushed hers. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Prickles swept over her skin and panic surged in her veins. She shoved him in the chest, pushing him away from her as flashes of the train came back to her, and she relived the terrifying feel of the man's hand locked around her wrist, his grip so tight she hadn't been able to break free, and how powerless she had been as she had struggled, the other passengers watching her and doing nothing to help her. The host boy stumbled and fell into one of his companions, who caught him. Megumi bowed as she muttered to the men, "We're sorry." Kumiko shot her a worried look. Aiko turned on her heel and hurried away from the men, her throat tight and breath wheezing as it tried to push through it. Her heart thundered, blood rushing as her legs shook and her hands trembled. She was safe. She wasn't back there. A flash of the dark-haired man towering over her, his blue eyes tranquil and locked on her, filled her mind, and her heart steadied at last, the adrenaline flowing from her as she slowed to a stop at a junction on the street. She breathed a little easier as she focused on him. He had saved her. Nothing bad had happened to her. He had made sure of that. He had stopped the pervert, and he had walked her home, and for a brief moment she had felt connected to him, in a way she had never felt connected to anyone before.
What happened?
Kumiko stopped beside her, a little out of breath, and Aiko waited until Megumi had caught up with them before she let the memory of the man slip from her mind and looked at her friends.
I'm sorry,
she whispered.
The other night, after we went out for dinner, a man on the train home, someone stopped him, but he tried to... Oh, Aiko!
Megumi pulled her into a tight hug, one that squeezed the air from her lungs again.
I never would have suggested we go near the boys if I had known.
She nodded, closed her eyes, and held her friend.
I know. I should have said something. I just thought I was over it.
But she wasn't, and she hated it. She hated being weak and letting things like that frighten her. She released Megumi and plastered a smile on her face, when all she really wanted to do was give up and let someone see what she was really feeling. Only she didn't want it to be her friends. She wanted to show him. She wanted him to see that whatever pain he held inside him, he wasn't alone. She hurt sometimes too. Sometimes she hated this world, but she picked herself up, held her head high, and kept marching forwards, bravely embracing whatever came next and not letting fear hold her back.
I could use a parfait,
she muttered, and when Kumiko laughed, it was infectious. She smiled too, feeling it this time, because there was nothing in this world a good amount of ice cream, fruit, whipped cream, and toppings couldn't fix. It was something they had all agreed on shortly after meeting. Megumi looped her arm around Aiko's left one.
Come on. It's been a while since we went to Nishimura Fruits Parlor.
It had probably been no more than a week, but their strawberry parfaits were by far her and her friends' favorites in the city. They had once joked about forming a weekly Nishimura study club that they had decided would honestly involve some study and not just gossiping and eating parfait until they were sick. Kumiko led the way back towards the main crossing, a bounce in her step now, and Aiko tried not to think about what had happened to her on the train, or the man who had saved her, but as she passed the spot where she felt sure she had seen him, she glanced that way and a feeling struck her. She hadn't been afraid of him. He had hurt the man who had tried to assault her, and had looked as if he had wanted to kill him and had barely restrained himself. He had a tattoo, scars, and had been injured in a fight. He was probably dangerous, yet she didn't fear him. In fact, she ached to see him again. Was it because he was different to the men around her? She tilted her head back as it started to rain, and Megumi broke away from her together with Kumiko, both of them rushing for the parfait parlor nearby. The streets were quick to clear, and umbrellas popped up above those who had been more prepared for the unpredictable spring weather. Aiko didn't run. She didn't put up an umbrella. She let the drops hit her face, warm against her skin. Let them linger rather than wiping them away, enjoying the feel of them, finding them comforting and soothing, because they made her feel connected to him again. A single thought formed in her mind, a question her heart answered in the affirmative. Was this his doing? Chapter 6. Esher reached the narrow cobbled street that was barely wide enough for a car, and paused outside the unusual gray facade of Lion, with its almost European arched entrance topped with blue Japanese roof tiles, and two sets of windows flanking a large pill-shaped one on the upper floor. Above him, the thick mass of electrical wires that chased along the street gave off a faint hum in his sensitive hearing as rain poured down, steadily growing heavier, soaking through his coat to his shirt and jeans. The street was mercifully empty, the weather chasing everyone away. Part of him felt bad about the rain, which was strange and unsettling. He never felt bad when his mood affected the weather and brought rain or a storm. So why did he feel bad this time? He pushed the door to the cafe open and headed straight upstairs, to his favorite corner, where the classical music played softly over the huge arrangement of wooden speakers visible on the balconied upper level sounded the best. He slid into the booth and breathed out a sigh as he sank into crimson velvet cushions. The interior of the cafe was dark, the walls painted black and the furniture resembling ebony wood, and worn in places. But it felt like a sanctuary to him, the low lighting and the darkness of it allowing him to relax and enjoy the music as it kept the eyes of the locals away from him. The female staff brought him his usual glass of water, setting it down as she bowed. He waited for her to rattle off the menu and walk away before he removed his earbuds. A different classical piece washed over him, and he closed his eyes, tipped his head back, and savored it. Her day was probably ruined because of him. It hit him hard, coming at him out of nowhere, and he frowned as he opened his eyes and stared at the water, and felt the rain outside as it struck the roofs across the city, and poured down on the people coming and going in the streets. That was why he felt bad. She was probably getting rained on, and her day out with her friends wrecked, and it was all his fault. He hadn't been able to keep a lid on his mood, and it had bled over, messing with the weather and spoiling what had looked as if it might be a beautiful sunset. Esher shifted his focus to the glass in front of him on the dark wooden table and his breathing, narrowing the world down to that one small amount of water. It trembled, the surface rippling as it began to take on the full force of his mood, his anger over the mortals, and his darkest desires. When the rain outside slowed, the water in the glass began to drip upwards, beads breaking from its surface to hang in the air above it. He toyed with them, moving them in time with the music, letting them distract him as they danced and played with each other. The rain stopped and everything seemed to still, outside him and inside him. The music softly played, and the few mortals in the cafe were silent in their enjoyment of it, a contrast to the bustling world outside where they were normally noisy and intrusive, and he needed the music to shut them out. But not her. He hadn't wanted to shut her out when he had been with her, and he had welcomed her presence when he had been watching her with her friends, as she had laughed and smiled, so carefree. He still couldn't believe he had followed her, studied her like that. She had never stopped smiling. It had come close to affecting him at one point, before his mood had gone south and a thought had hit him. Would she smile so much if she knew the real world, and the future that awaited it if he and his brothers failed? He wanted her to keep on smiling. He wanted to keep her world from colliding with his to make that happen. Diamond appeared in the booth opposite him, looked down and arched a white eyebrow at the glass, and then lifted his icy blue eyes to his. "Your water is raining." Esher looked down at it, watching the miniature storm he had created in the glass. Better it rained in there than outside on her. "I told you not to bother me here." Esher let the storm build until the water turned choppy. Diamond touched his gloved fingers to the outside of the glass, a brief caress, but enough to affect the water. Tiny icebergs formed, and some of the rain became snow. Esher tossed him an unimpressed look. "Our conversation wasn't finished." Diamond leaned back, rubbed his white hair, and waved his hand, signaling the waitress. She bustled over, and his brother shifted to Japanese. "I'll have what he's having." She bowed and walked away, returning a moment later with a tall glass of water. "Cheers." Diamond nodded to her and then turned to him and mock scowled. "No making my water rain, all right?" Esher ignored him, closing his eyes and trying to shut him out by focusing on the music, because he could feel the clouds building again outside, and he wanted to hold the rain at bay. "Where did you go?" His brother just wouldn't shut up, would he? He clamped his jaw tight, the muscles tensing in it as he gave up trying to control his mood. It was impossible when Diamond was poking his buttons, doing it on purpose to make him talk. His brother wasn't going to give up until he told him something. It didn't have to be the truth. He stared at the tall wooden speakers suspended on the wall above the ground floor, and his thoughts returned to the female. He should stay away from her, should let her live her life in peace. But gods, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Whenever he tried to push her out of his head forever, whenever he came close to shutting himself off from her, he ended up thinking about how much he wanted to see her again, and there was a part of him that didn't care if that placed her in danger. He feared it was the same part that wanted to kill all the humans, and that by giving in to it, he might only be luring her to her doom, tricked by his own other self. "I just needed some space. I didn't want to hurt you again." It was part truth. He really didn't want to harm his brothers, especially Diamond. Unless they were sparring. Then Diamond got what he deserved. Because of the Wraith? Or Megan? Those words were carefully weighed, and Esher looked at him again. He didn't like thinking about what she had done for him, because he didn't like owing his life to her, a mortal, not even when she was becoming part of their family now, just as Ava was. Both, he murmured, and Diamond sighed, but he continued before his brother could speak. The Wraith's blade. Don't tell anyone because I don't need them fussing like I'm some special fucking snowflake. Swear it. Diamond crossed his heart, his expression deadly serious, which was as much of a promise as Esher would get out of him. I'm still healing, Esher blurted. His brother's white eyebrows dipped low, the corners of his lips turning downwards as his eyes brightened, his anger shining in them. What do you mean? You should be healed by now. He tried to reach across the table, and Esher swatted his hand away before he could grab his shirt and lift it to see the wound. It looks like a scar, but sometimes I feel it. It hurts, and I'm weaker than normal. Esher caught hold of his gray shirt when Diamond looked as if he might make another attempt to see, and tugged it up enough to flash the scar at him. Some of the worry in his brother's eyes faded, but a hell of a lot remained, and it was there in his voice, too, as he leaned towards him, pushing the glass of water aside. It instantly froze, and frost flowers grew outwards from Diamond's hands as he pressed them into the tabletop. Megan healed you, though. Diamond's eyes darted between his, as if he could see in them whether or not she had. She stopped the toxin on the blade from killing me, and the wound healed. But what if some of it remained? What if I'm still purging it now? And that's the reason I took so long to come around. It made too much sense to Esher to be anything else. He wasn't dying and didn't feel as if his soul was in jeopardy, but he wasn't quite right yet either. He ran his finger around the rim of his glass, making the water chase it. I feel stronger every day. So you are purging it. Diamond sounded relieved but uncertain at the same time. Esher nodded because everything pointed towards that being the case, but it was taking a long time, and he was getting pretty damn sick of feeling weak, and could damn well live without the attacks that left him feeling as if he was going to collapse again. The memories the sudden flaring of the wound provoked were as much responsible for that temporary weakness as the toxin was, though. It was a psychological reflex, like the one he had whenever he thought about humans, or the times he saw his brothers in danger. His twisted fucking mind used it as a chance to bombard him with memories of events that tore at him, as powerful now as they had been when he had lived them. Come back to the mansion, Diamond said, cutting into his thoughts before they could lead him down a dark path. He nodded in agreement, but only because he could see Diamond needed him safe now that he knew the toxin was still weakening him. His brother wanted him protected by the powerful wards that shielded the mansion, locking everyone but him and his brothers out of it. Not because he feared the Wraith would come for him again while he was weakened, but because he feared the female demon their enemies had spoken of would. It wouldn't surprise him if Diamond insisted on taking gate duty in Tokyo until he was healed, and forced him to remain in the mansion at all times. He would go crazy if his brother did, which was another odd thing. Normally, he hated being out in the city, avoided it as much as he could. But as they teleported back to the mansion, all Esher could think about was how he wanted to walk the streets, because he wanted to see her again. When they landed on the porch of the mansion, the shoe rack was almost full, and he glared at Diamond. His younger brother shrugged. Don't kill me. It was Cal's idea. Esher glared at the thick wooden door to his left, and the noise coming from inside the building, and the rain started again. Fucking hell, Ares grumbled from what sounded like outside, possibly in the courtyard. It just stopped. Diamond pushed the door open to reveal Cal setting the long, low wooden dining table, and Valen arranging cushions around it with the help of Marek and Karis pacing. Beyond them, through the open doors to the garden, Ares paused when he crouched on the gravel, and Esher candid his head at his older brother. Tidying? That wasn't like Ares. Normally, he lived in an apartment that looked as if Cal had swept through it in a mood, clothes and food cartons strewn everywhere. But here he was, smoothing down the gravel so every damned piece was back in its rightful place. Esher dialed his mood back, even when he wanted to demand to know what his brothers were all doing in the mansion just so he could watch them splutter excuses about everything from a family night to a meeting, to more flimsy ones like they had wanted to see his gorgeous face. He appreciated the fuck out of one thing about this gathering: Aries fixing the gravel. The rest of it meant nothing. Irritated him a little if he was honest, because it was obvious his brothers were only here to keep him occupied and protected. If they just happened to be in Tokyo on the night the gate was attacked, they also just happened to be on hand to fight either at his side or in his place. He didn't need bodyguards, although he reluctantly admitted to himself that he would have behaved the same way if it had been one of his brothers in his situation. But Aries fixing the mess in the garden, that was priceless. Gold. Smoothed the edges off his mood enough that he decided to stop the weather from raining all over his eternally grumpy older brother. Aries glanced up, his overlong tawny hair clinging in damp waves to his neck and cheeks where it had come free from the band he tied it back with, and then looked back inside at him. Appreciated. He nodded, showing his brother he felt the same way, and stripped off his coat, and went into the kitchen on the far left of the long room beyond the dining table. Diamond followed and parked himself against the cupboards behind him, hindering more than helping as they went to work on making dinner. He listened to Diamond drone on about the new building they were throwing up in Hong Kong and how there wouldn't be any sky left soon, as he chopped vegetables. His brother liked to complain, but Esher knew he loved the view of the modern neon-lit skyscrapers from his villa on the side of Victoria Peak. He pushed the vegetables aside, ignoring the fact that Diamond had managed to chop a single onion in the time it had taken him to chop countless vegetables, and focused on preparing the meat. Lots of meat. His brothers ate like pigs when he fed them, probably because most of them didn't know how to cook and relied on eating out or ordering in. Cal's voice rose above the din in the other room, Karis's deep one joining it as he challenged him to a round, and Marek joked that he would pay to see Karis beat their youngest brother at his own game. Not likely to happen. Karis was awful at video games. Where were Valen and Aries? A soft female voice broke through the male ones, and Esher frowned, leaned back, and glared into the room to his left. At a slim mortal dressed in skin-tight black jeans and a halter top, the hem of it lifting as she pushed a bright blue streak in her short black hair out of her cerulean eyes. Ava. Before he could ask what she was doing there, he spotted Megan beside her, the slender brunette's dark eyes bright as they talked while she tied her shoulder-length chestnut hair up. Aries curled a protective arm around her waist, his all-black clothing a contrast to her jewel-green t-shirt and blue jeans. Next to Ava, Valen grinned, the scar that ran down the left side of his jaw and neck pulling tight. Both females were flushed, cheeks bright pink, and freshly showered by the looks of things. At least they had taken their shoes off this time. He stilled as Megan gestured, waving her arms in a dramatic fashion. Scowled. Bruises littered her arms. Had someone hurt her? The thought that someone might have drew a startling reaction from him. He wanted to hunt them down and hurt them back. Megan was family now. His family. Anyone fucked with her, they fucked with him too, even if she was mortal. Ava spoke, arresting his attention, her Italian accent thickly lacing her words.
It was a good session. I think next time we should use some dummy weapons.
Ava was teaching Megan to fight? Sensible, he supposed. Mortals were weak, no match for a god or even a demon. The little female he had met hadn't even been able to fend off a human male. A powerful need filled him as that thought flowed through him, one that struck him silent and froze him in place halfway through drawing the knife down the chopping board to push the meat into the pot. His mother's words swam in his mind, her voice whispering at him to forgive and to learn to love the mortals again. His own ones followed, a denial that had been nothing more than a growl at the time, that he would never forgive them and he would never love a mortal. But he wanted to protect her, his fascinating little butterfly. Chapter 7. The day had turned hot at some point, and even with the panels open to allow air to flow into his room, Esher hadn't been able to slip back to sleep after waking from a nightmare. Agitated from trying, he had left his room, grabbed a bite to eat and a glass of water, and had tried to focus on small tasks to keep his mind occupied, trimming the topiary, feeding the fish, enjoying the cherry blossoms. None of it had held his focus for long. His mind had kept drifting, and it had always returned to one subject: her. She had slipped into his usual nightmare, inserting herself into the scene, but not where he had expected her to be. Rather than being one of his tormentors with the other humans, she had been the one bound before him. They had tortured her to weaken him. Gods. Esher ran a shaky hand over his black hair and drew in a deep breath to calm his turbulent emotions as he walked, afraid that if they got the better of him, Diamond would feel it and would realize he had left the safety of the mansion grounds. He needed to walk. He needed space. He had been cooped up in the mansion for days now, and he was feeling stronger, more than able to take care of himself if anyone dared to attack him. Besides, it was daylight. Not even a strong demon could withstand this much sunshine. They would be insane to try. Strings harmonized with a brass section in his ears as he paused at a crossing and waited for the lights to change in his favor. Ahead of him, on the other side of the road, the park was busy, mortals soaking up the sunshine as they walked alone or with friends and occupied the benches, and seemingly every inch of the broad path beneath the trees. Fucking Sundays. Normally, if he came for a walk in Yoyogi Park, he had it mostly to himself, with only a smattering of humans, a low enough number that it rarely bothered him. But on a Sunday, it felt as if every person in Tokyo was trying to squeeze into the open spaces to enjoy the small pocket of nature. He couldn't blame them, but that didn't mean he had to accept their presence. The red light flicked to green on the other side of the street, and he edged away from the mortals as he crossed, giving himself at least 3 meters space. Better. Now he just had to survive the heaving park and find a quiet spot to make his own. The solitude of the garden at the mansion was starting to look appealing again, but he needed this. He needed to see the modern buildings that crammed into every street around the park, and hear the noise of the trains as they constantly rumbled into the station, and the revving of car engines as they pulled away from the traffic lights. He needed it because it was miles away from how the world had been all those centuries ago, a contrast that reminded him that he wasn't there now. The world was different now. His kind could move undetected through the streets, and even if a mortal witnessed something out of the ordinary, they normally kept it to themselves, believing themselves overworked, or even fucking blessed to have seen something they believed was supernatural. It was a far cry from the days when just being different had been enough to raise an army or a mob against you. Witches still had a bad rap, though, some of them for a good reason. He had met a few in his 800-plus years, and quite a number of them had deserved the reputation they had gained among mortals. The rest of them were all right as long as you didn't cross them. Even gods could be cursed. He strolled down to the entrance of the park and looked up as he moved into the shade of the towering trees that stretched from either side of the dirt path to tangle together high above it. The air was instantly cooler, the perpetual shade keeping the heat of day at bay, and he breathed a little easier as it washed over him while the music danced in his ears and sunlight sparkled through the small gaps in the green canopy above. Esher tugged at the collar of the gray t-shirt he wore beneath his dark blue linen shirt, wafting air down his chest, enjoying the coolness of it as it bathed his skin. A human suddenly closed the distance between them, leaping into his path, and his hand twitched, a heartbeat away from backhanding them away from him, when he froze, the awareness that blasted through him halting him in his tracks. He lowered his blue gaze to the petite female standing before him, a vision in a black ruffled skirt, violet stockings, platform pink patent shoes, and a tank with a diamante skull on the front. Her bunches swayed as she canted her head and said something he didn't hear over the music pounding in his ears. When she continued to speak, her enticing glossy lips shifting in a symphony in time with the rising strings, he gathered his wits enough to pull on the cord in front of his chest, tugging the buds from his ears. "Sorry," he said in Japanese, and a pink hue climbed her cheeks. Music was on.
"It's you again."
Her smile hit him hard, reaching her dark chocolate eyes, and she rocked on her heels, her hands locked behind her back. For a split second he considered leaving, and that was strange. Because when faced with a human trying to interact with him without him prompting it, he always ignored them and moved on as quickly as possible, evading them. But something about her, his little butterfly, soothed him and made him want to stay, calmed him more than being alone.
How is your arm?
Her English words were stilted, lacking confidence that she seemed to exude when speaking her native tongue, and she nodded towards his arm when he just stared at her. Esher looked down at it. He had finally taken the bandage off 2 days ago, had meant to discard it in the bin, but in the end had placed it in a box that stood on his chest of drawers in his room. Which was strange, too. He had no reason to want to keep the used bandage, yet he couldn't bring himself to part with it. "It's fine now, but thank you." He stuck to Japanese for her, wanting her to be comfortable so she would speak more with him. Also strange. Feminine giggling had her looking to her right and widening her eyes in a way that screamed "shut up" at the pair of females sitting beneath the tree on a bench. The 2 females from the day she had been walking in Shibuya. Her friends? They were dressed like her now, gothic lolitas enjoying a day off in the park. It was common on a Sunday in Yoyogi Park, the proximity of the Harajuku shopping street bringing them into the area.
Wait.
She held her hand up between them, and then hurried to her friends, grabbed a black satin bag with a crimson frill around the zipper and a collection of figures dangling from the strap, and a green drink in a clear plastic cup, and bounced back to him. She sipped on the matcha iced smoothie as she walked away from him, her ruffled black skirt bouncing with each step, flashing a lot of leg. When she paused and looked back at him, a little frown wrinkling her nose, he followed, assuming it was what she wanted.
I'm glad your arm is better. I was worried.
She hit him with another high-beam smile as he caught up with her. Had she really been worried about him? She looked the type to worry about strangers, and she was studying medicine. She was gentle and good. He could see it in her as she kept glancing at his arm whenever she had the chance, checking the wound that was barely a scar peeking out from beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his navy shirt, needing to see for herself that he was better. He gazed at his boots as he carefully rolled up the lead of his earbuds and put them in his breast pocket. Her feet were tiny compared with his, her step light despite the thick 2-inch platform soles of her shoes. With them on, she fell short of his shoulder. How small would she be against him without them?
What's your name?
When he looked up at her face, she covered her mouth, a blush staining her cheeks, and her obvious embarrassment over asking such a question outright, something out of place for a Japanese female, almost teased a smile from him. Esher. He had no qualms about her knowing it, mostly because she would offer hers in exchange.
Esher, Esher, Esher.
She frowned as she tried to wrap her mouth around it, her chocolate eyes on the path in front of her. Those warm eyes lifted to him again, and another smile curved her lips.
You would say it, Aiko Matsumoto.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Aiko. And it was. Strange. She giggled.
How long have you been in Japan to know the language so well, but not learn the customs?
A long time, he countered. But you didn't strike me as the sort to want to be given an honorific or go with tradition. I can call you Matsumoto-chan if you preferred. Or maybe I-chan? She laughed, the sound more entrancing than even the most beautiful classical piece, and shook her head as she waved her hand in front of her face.
No, Aiko is fine.
With that, she broke away from him, her eyes darting everywhere as she sipped her drink through the straw, taking in all the nature that surrounded her. Its beauty was lost on him as he watched her, his little butterfly more stunning and fascinating than a few ancient trees. She pirouetted to face him and walked backwards in front of him.
Are you alone in Tokyo?
Esher shook his head, frowned when his hair fell down over his left eye and obscured her, and pushed it back, threading his fingers through the black lengths as he watched her. A flicker of sorrow crossed her features, but it disappeared when he spoke. I live with one of my younger brothers. Technically true, although Diamond was spending more and more time in Hong Kong recently. Was she relieved because he didn't live with a female?
What do you do? It's unusual for foreigners to live in Japan. Do you teach?
She moved back to beside him again. Teaching was a common profession for foreigners, but the only teaching he did was to demons, and constantly trying to make them learn the lesson that he wasn't going to let them near the gate to the underworld. Still, he didn't want to be thought of as a teacher. It reminded him too much of long, boring lessons in the underworld, listening to various tutors drone on about history and such, and it was leagues from what he really did. I work in defense. Also technically true. Her eyes widened.
Like the military?
He shrugged as they rounded a bend in the path, an enormous Tory gate coming into view. Something like that. Aiko passed beneath the imposing wooden structure of 2 columns supporting a curved beam, with another beam intersecting them below it. Apparently, some believed it was lucky to walk through the gate that marked an entrance to the Shinto shrine. Maybe if you were human. Esher walked around the thick left column, feeling the power in the gate as he avoided it. He never had gotten along with the local gods. Even walking the sacred grounds on the other side of the gate as he was now was often enough to cause a mild sense of discomfort, as if someone was giving him the evil eye. Aiko moved back to walk beside him, on his right this time, and her eyes fell to his arm.
You have so many scars.
Her words were soft, not meant to hurt, but they carved his heart open and he fell silent as he struggled against the surge of memories that collided with the fragments of his nightmare. He battled them, trying to hold them at bay, but the nightmare had left him weak against them, allowing them to easily push at him, rousing his other side, the one that whispered to him and had him eyeing all the mortals passing by, a desire to punish them rising inside him. His gaze drifted over Aiko and back again, the need to leave warred with a desire to stay near her, to protect her from the cruel humans who wanted to hurt her, and him. When they neared the grand shrine, she moved away from him, and he reached for her, his heart lunging into his throat. His hand stopped just short of her bare arm as she paused and looked his way, her eyes falling to it and then rising to his face.
I just need to go inside. Come too,
she said softly, warm light in the midst of the darkness raging inside him. Esher shook his head and let his hand fall to his side, and she stared at him a moment, concern filling her eyes before she rallied, blinking and then smiling again.
Will you wait?
She moved a step closer to him, and it struck him that she didn't want to part from him either. And gods, that was the strangest thing yet. He nodded, still struggling with the tide of memories and unable to find his voice as they raged inside him, a violent sea he was trying to tame, for her sake. She moved away from him, stopping at the rectangular stone trough of water beneath an elegant open-sided wooden structure, topped with a sweeping copper roof that had gone almost turquoise over the centuries. She purified herself and then walked towards the main gate of the shrine, an imposing wooden building that stood twice as tall as the walls around it, topped with the same sweeping copper roof, and he took a step towards the shrine, wanting to follow her. An invisible barrier repelled him, and he bared his teeth at the shrine and the gods who forbid him to enter it. He had tried to get them to manifest and explain themselves so they could understand each other, but the bastards refused to speak with him, merely repelled him whenever he tried to enter a shrine. Unable to follow her, he drifted away instead, towards the shade of the trees where no humans ventured, and put his earbuds back in to block out the noise so he could focus on calming himself. No matter how loud he made the music, the gnawing feeling persisted, thoughts of Aiko at the mercy of the humans filling his mind, tormenting him with images of her from his nightmare, bound and bleeding, close to death. He closed his eyes, wanting to shut out the world, sure it was the presence of all the humans pushing him deeper into his memories. It only worsened things. Instead of seeing only flashes of images from his nightmare, he replayed the whole damned thing, felt himself bound and fighting against the ropes that bit into his arms, felt his throat burn as he screamed at them to stop and begged the bastards for mercy they refused to give. The whispers grew louder, becoming chanting that goaded him into showing them no mercy in return. They were ants, and he would crush them for what they had done to him. Warm, soft fingers brushed his right hand, caressed the inside of his wrist where his favor mark stood pronounced on his skin, and chased the dark memories away, allowing light to filter back in and breath to fill his lungs again. He slowly opened his eyes and looked down into Aiko's, and didn't stop her when she lifted her hands and carefully removed the noise-canceling headphones from his ears. He stood mute, staring at her, shaken to his core and weak to his bones. She smiled gently.
You moved, and your smile is gone. You're serious again.
Had he smiled for her? He might have. More than once he had wanted to do it, and maybe he had, but he couldn't remember now. Everything was clouded again, just like the sky. Heavy black ones were rolling in, and he could feel the rain coming. It was partly his fault. His mood had taken a nosedive, speeding the weather that had already been building in the distance. Strangely, he didn't want it to rain, was sure this time he wouldn't find any comfort in it, because it would separate him from Aiko. But he couldn't contain his pain to stop it. "I need to get out of here," he husked, his eyes darting over all the humans as they stared at him. She nodded.
We can visit the tea house by the pond. Hardly anyone goes there.
Sounded like heaven to him. He followed her as the clouds reached them, blocking out the sun, and the wind picked up. They backtracked towards the Tory gate, and she stopped a short distance from it, a frown marring her face as she stared at a sign, then at him.
It's closed.
She sounded as disappointed as he felt. Esher didn't hesitate. He grabbed her waist with both hands, eliciting a squeak from her, and lifted her over the gate, doing his damnedest not to look at her panties. They were pink. She dropped to the leaf litter on the other side, landing in a crouch, and moved aside. He vaulted the gate.
I've never broken a law before.
She looked more excited than upset about the fact she was breaking into the garden, and he didn't have the heart to mention that she was hardly going to get arrested for being in the garden when it was closed. Reprimanded maybe, like a slap on the wrist. This was Z-grade breaking the law. If she wanted to see A-grade, he could show her. She crept along the narrow path through the thick trees like a damned ninja, and he strolled past her, the need to reach the tea house and the quiet driving him. If a human was around and spotted them, he would deal with them. And for once, he didn't mean by killing them. He would wipe their memory. The elegant single-story wooden building came into view around a bend in the path, nestled with its back against the trees, and wood-framed glass panels protecting the walkway beneath the flared roof, and the paper panels of the interior. It faced a sloping garden of grass and manicured bushes that resembled large smooth boulders in the dimming light, and beyond that a broad lake surrounded by trees. The agony clawing at him began to fade as he looked at it, breathing easier as he sensed only Aiko nearby, and smelled the water and the coming rain. The skies opened. Esher grabbed her slender wrist and ran with her, trying not to pull her along as he raced towards the tea house, and used what little control he had over his powers and the weather to ensure not a drop of rain hit them. When they reached the slight overhang above the exterior glass panels of the tea house, she tucked closer to him, breathing hard. He released her, used his telekinesis to unlock the doors and push them back to allow her entrance. She stopped on the high stone step to remove her shoes, and then stepped inside. Rain poured off the roof in torrents, cascading like a waterfall behind him as he removed his boots and followed her inside.
I didn't get wet.
She looked down at her clothes, over her bare arms, and then at him. Her expression shifted, going from one of surprise to something else. But if she noticed anything in his eyes, she kept it to herself. She pushed aside one of the paper panels and stepped into the main open room of the small building, her purple stockings a contrast to the creamy yellow of the traditional straw tatami mats. He trailed after her, catching her just as she moved to the front of the building and pushed more panels open to reveal the garden. Aiko eased onto her knees in the middle of the open panels, her back to him, eyes on the outside world. The grass looked greener in the rain, and the surface of the lake had gone dark gray as it rippled with the heavy downpour. It was beautiful. She looked over her shoulder at him, her long black hair brushing her bare shoulders. She was beautiful. He moved towards her, drawn to her, unable to stop himself from closing the distance between them and easing onto his backside beside her. Her dark eyes moved back to the world beyond the glass.
I like the rain, the melody it makes. It soothes me and seems to carry my troubles away.
When she glanced at him, he smiled at her, wanting to show her that he felt the same way. She blushed and looked away again. How old was she? Megan had mentioned something about being in her 30s, but Aiko appeared younger than her, mid-20s if he had to hazard a guess. She had barely seen this world, probably knew very little of its darker side other than what she had seen on the television or in movies. Fuck. He wanted to keep it that way. He wanted her to always be this pure, this full of life and hope and happiness. He wanted to shield her from the darker things, to keep the light inside her shining. Her blush deepened. Because he was staring at her? Because they were alone? That had a hint of color rising onto his cheeks, too. He wasn't sure he had ever been alone with a mortal, and he couldn't remember being alone with a female like this before either. He hadn't considered that when she had offered to take him to the tea house, or when he had broken in with her. He had just wanted to escape, to find peace, but he hadn't wanted to part from her.
Do you feel better now?
Her gaze bravely came back to him. He nodded and relief flitted across her face, and he wanted to say something, but could only stare into her eyes as she looked deep into his and murmured,
You have eyes like the ocean.
He averted them and she leaned towards him. His breath seized in his lungs as she moved closer to him, her soft floral scent teasing his senses, and her body heat brushed against him. He froze when her hand neared his right arm, his body coiling tight, as he waited for her to touch the scars and mention them again, a spike of fear driving through him as he willed her not to do it, because he was finally on even ground again, and he didn't want the memories to surface once more. Rather than touching his scars, her fingers stroked a line over the trident mark on his inside wrist.
The gods watch over you,
she whispered, and he looked down at the favor mark, given to him at his birth by Poseidon, his uncle. When she looked up at him, her face so close to his, he forgot what he had wanted to say. He swallowed hard and stared at her, battling an urge that felt more powerful than any he had experienced before. Not an urge to hurt her. Far from it. This urge had nerves sweeping through him, a fierce flood of them that left him shaking as he stared at her, his heart thumping against his ribs. She blinked slowly, shuddering her warm brown eyes, stealing them from view for a heartbeat before they locked with his again. Her pupils dilated, devouring her rich, earthy irises, echoing the need that surged inside him. He raised his hands, focused to stop the damn things from trembling, and swallowed to wet his parched throat as he edged them towards her, and finally, carefully, placed his palms against her cheeks, touching her. God, she was warm, soft beneath his calloused palms, his little butterfly, beautiful and delicate, trembling in his hands. He meant to leave it at that, to release her and not risk anything else, but she shifted on her knees, placed her hands against the mats to support herself, and brought her lips up to his. Fire and lightning crashed through him as they brushed his, the sweetness of her lip gloss coating his, filling his mouth with the taste of strawberries. And hunger surged through him, a need to taste more of her, to completely devour her. On a low growl, he slid his hand around the back of her neck and pulled her to him, his mouth claiming hers. He tried to hold back his strength, the raging tide of his desire, the maelstrom of his need, but it was impossible as sensations collided and detonated inside him. He kissed her deeply, fucking clumsily if he had to admit it, his hand shaking against her nape as he stiltedly swept his lips across hers, and she blissfully responded, her own actions as jerky as his, as if desire was overcoming her too, stealing control. Sweet gods! The rain lashed down, striking the roof so hard that it shook the wooden structure, the weather turning more violent as a new need surged through him. He wanted to touch her. Intimately. A growl tore up his throat, a need to go through with that driving him to obey, and he barely leashed it, holding it back as he broke away from her lips, shock rippling through him. He couldn't believe he wanted to do such a thing, or the ferocity of his hunger to be inside her. A mortal. Esher stared at her, breathing hard, fighting to restrain himself and tamp down that need. She looked at him, lips swollen and red from his brutal kiss, Her pale skin darkened beneath his palm by the pressure of his grip. He had been rough with her, but she hadn't pushed him away, and she still looked at him as if she wanted to kiss him again, as if what he had given her wasn't enough for her either. Fuck. She was beautiful as she looked at him like that. Something soft and almost affectionate in her desire-hazed eyes, her shy smile luring him in, together with the way she was hiding nothing from him. Her warmth and honesty, her openness, drew him towards her, and he wanted to drown in her. That scared him. What the fuck was he doing? It was dangerous for her to be around him, but he couldn't let her go. He needed her. He couldn't have her, though. All it would take was the moon's sway to get to him, or his memories to overwhelm him. It would take only a momentary slip in control, and he would hurt her. His powers had always been strong and as unpredictable as the ocean, and since what had happened to Calindria, he had been more than dangerous. Aiko was strong, he could see that, but it was a strength of spirit, not of body. She was delicate, and he wanted to protect her because of it. He wanted her to always smile. He released her and eased back, the hardest fucking thing he had ever done, and looked at the world outside. The rain was so heavy that he couldn't see anything beyond the glass. His fault. As much as it killed him to stop, he needed to find some calm again, some sliver of control. Because he didn't want to hurt her. Gods help him. He didn't want to fuck up and be the one to kill that smile of hers. Chapter 8. Aiko watched the rain, fascinated by it as it began to ease again, growing lighter the longer Esher was silent beside her. She could feel his struggle, that he needed time she would give to him. As the garden began to appear through the haze of the rain again, she wished her nerves would ease like the weather and fade away. She couldn't believe she was sitting in the tea house with Esher, but they had broken into this place. She knew she should feel bad or it should feel wrong, but being around Esher only ever felt right. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, her body alive with sensation as he sat beside her, his hands planted behind him to support him as his long legs stretched before him, the black denim wrinkled around his ankles where it had been jammed into his boots. His eyes remained locked on the world beyond the glass, and while he was close to her, she felt as if he was miles away. She wanted him to come back to her, wanted to kiss him again and feel his hands on her. She glanced across at him. He was on edge, though. She could feel it in him. Something was troubling him. The same thing that had been troubling him when she had left the shrine and found he had moved away from it. The moment she had stepped over the threshold of the shrine, she had sensed the god's unease, and something that had felt like anger to her, and part of her had felt certain that it had been directed at Esher, because he was a foreign spirit in their land, an intruder. She moved onto her backside and drew her knees up to her chest as she studied his noble profile, focusing on him and trying to understand the sensation that swirled in her chest as she watched him. He didn't feel like a threat, but she could sense the darkness in him, just as she could feel the power of the tides surging through him. He was one with nature, very in tune with it, and it awed her. Her grandmother had been a shrine maiden in a small village high in the mountains, and she had always amused Aiko with stories of how she had danced with the gods and seen the spirits. Aiko had thought they were only tales, but after her grandmother had passed and she had visited the shrine to pay her respects, she had felt the presence there and had been able to see a faint shimmering in the air that moved as if it was something crossing the space before her. Over the years that had followed, her ability had developed, growing stronger. And now she could clearly sense spirits, and had even seen one or two manifest themselves for her. It was the reason she visited the shrines as often as she could, so she could pay her respects to them. Esher was different, though. He was flesh and blood. He lived and breathed and even smiled at times. He was stronger, too. Was he more of a god than a spirit? And if he was a god, was he benevolent or destructive? His head tilted towards her, his gaze coming to meet hers, and in it she saw a tempest building. Or was he both? She was tempted to peer deeper into his feelings, but she had learned not to abuse her powers. Her grandmother had always warned her that people were private creatures, and that she should treat them with respect. She hadn't heeded that warning until she had pried into the private feelings of some girls who had befriended her in high school, and had discovered they were only pretending to be her friend. Now she read people the old-fashioned way, and Esher's body language told her enough about his feelings. He was struggling with himself. "I should go," he muttered as the weather turned worse again, the rain so heavy it was almost deafening as it struck the tea-house roof. She wanted to ask him to stay, but there was something about his eyes that made her hold her tongue. They were haunted, shadowed, and she could feel fear in him, unease. She could feel something else in him, too, that what he wanted and what he said were two conflicting things, the complete opposites to each other. He didn't want to go. His pupils dilated, gobbling up the stormy blue, and his breath came faster as he stared at her, his chest heaving against his navy shirt and gray t-shirt. The source of his unease hit her, and she knew how to soothe it. She moved back onto her knees, coming to face him, and didn't hesitate as she framed his face with her hands and kissed him. He was quick to respond, his trembling hands instantly claiming her hips and tugging her against his hard chest. She shook too, nerves getting the better of her as she thought about what she was doing, combined with the desire that flared inside her, startling in its intensity. She drowned in it as he fell backwards, taking her with him, and she landed on his chest, his hip pressing against hers. She moaned as he rolled with her so she was on her back beneath him, his right knee wedged between her thighs and his left arm locked beneath her head like a pillow, caging her against him. His kiss softened, his breath shaking against her lips, as he skimmed his right hand down her arm, his touch surprisingly light, sending shivers of fire chasing over her skin. When his hand closed over her left breast, she arched into his touch and couldn't hold back.
"Don't stop this time."
Those words leaving her lips in a breathless rush, both a plea and a demand in them, shocked her and her cheeks burned. She could feel he was going to pull back and look at her, so she grabbed him around the back of his neck, his short black hair tickling her fingers, and pulled him down to her and kissed him. His tongue plunged between her lips and she opened for him, couldn't breathe as he palmed her breast and sent wave after wave of hot tingles rushing through her, lighting her up inside. She moaned and he joined her, his left hand clutching her shoulder as he kissed her, his heart pounding as quickly as hers. He squeezed her breast again and then hastily released it, and she wanted to chastise him, but he stole her voice as he tugged her tank down to reveal her pink bra and brushed his thumb over the curve of her breast. He groaned as he pulled away and looked at what he was doing, and she shivered as his hips surged forwards and his hardness pressed against her right thigh. Her heart skipped a beat as she gazed up at him, a little dazed, finding it difficult to believe she was doing this, letting him touch her like this, and that she wanted more. His hand shifted so his palm sat over her heart, and she squeezed her eyes shut, her brow furrowing as his fingers slipped beneath the satin of her bra and brushed her nipple, sending 1,000 volts shooting down to the apex of her thighs. His mouth seized hers again, swallowing her next moan, and she trembled and arched into his touch, lost in the sizzling sensations as they whipped through her, an assault she wasn't sure she could withstand. He angled his head and kissed her deeper still, his touch growing rougher as he shifted his hand over her stomach. When she realized where he was heading, when she felt his trembling worsen, his nerves rising, she couldn't hold back the moan that bubbled up her throat, couldn't stop herself from letting her left knee fall aside, revealing the apex of her thighs for him. His low groan as his hand sank beneath the frills of her skirt to brush her satin panties had another shiver tripping through her, the burn of desire growing fiercer as she kissed him harder, unable to hold herself back anymore. He moaned as she surrendered to her need and plundered his mouth with her tongue. He bucked against her thigh, rubbing himself along it, stirring her desire to dizzying new heights, filling her mind with the delectable vision of them entwined. She bit down on her lower lip as he slipped his fingers beneath the elastic of her underwear, her breath coming faster as he eased back and his gaze scalded her face. She struggled to open her eyes as his fingers drifted lower, and his first caress sent her hips shooting upwards and a white-hot blast of heat through her. When she managed to get them open, they locked with his. A storm raged in them, the blue of his irises swirling with the tempest, speaking to her of his need, of how this was affecting him as deeply as it was her. She let it sweep her along as she gave in to him, to the need that broke over her like a wave and carried her away. She rocked against his hand as he fondled her, finger teasing her pert bead, intense sparks of fire skittering through her in response to each one. With every stroke and press, the storm in his eyes built and the rain grew heavier, deafening now as she surged towards release. She trembled as she gripped his shoulders, lost in his eyes as he sank his hand lower and eased a finger into her. Her need spiraled higher as she imagined him inside her like that, stretching and filling her, moving inside her. She needed that, needed him. She bit her tongue to stop herself from asking it of him, though, aware that his fear hadn't gone anywhere, lingered even now as he lowered his gaze from her face to his hand where it touched her. He looked as if he was having a difficult time believing they were doing this. She was. She had never been intimate with anyone, had never felt the desire to do it, but she couldn't control herself around him. He drove her wild, had her gripping his shoulders so tightly she feared she might hurt him as she reached a crescendo. He stroked her deeper, rubbing the pads of his fingers over her flesh as he withdrew, and she shattered. His gaze leaped to her face as she broke apart, a cry leaving her lips, so loud she feared someone might hear over the noise of the rain, and she was sure that he growled as he lowered his head and pressed his brow to her cheek, and his cock to her hip. It kicked and throbbed in time with each quiver of her body around his fingers, in time with each wave of bliss that rolled through her and crashed over her, stealing the breath she had managed to catch each time. Awareness grew inside her as she lay with him, coming down from her high, and it birthed a need so powerful she couldn't deny it. He needed release too. She wanted to be the one to give it to him. Chapter 9. Esher shifted onto his knees when Aiko moved, reaching for his jeans. "You don't have—" He lost the ability to speak as she unbuttoned his fly and gritted his teeth as her small hand found his aching shaft. He hissed and tipped his head back, the heat and softness of her too much for him to bear. He couldn't stop himself from rocking against her, and as she stroked him, gaining confidence, he began to forget about his need to stop her. Almost started to enjoy it, until a dark snarl burst from his lips, torn from him by a black urge to get her damned hand off him before she could harm him. He took hold of her wrist and pushed her back as he leaned away from her so she couldn't touch him again, controlling her in the only way he could without hurting her, without leaving. He had to leave. Her dark eyes fell to his hips, to the hard outline of his cock and his black trunks, and then lifted to his side. The desire that had been in them faded, replaced with concern, and a frown wrinkled her nose. She reached out with her free hand, and he shook as she edged it towards the scar above his left hip, visible now that he had leaned back, his shirt and t-shirt riding up his stomach to reveal it.
Esher,
she whispered softly, and he felt her worry.
I thought your wound was on the other side.
Her eyes darted to his, and he realized that for all his attempts to keep the stab wound from her the night they had met, she had been aware of it. But she hadn't mentioned it. She had been aware of something else, too, that he hadn't wanted her to know. He hadn't wanted her to be aware of just how vulnerable, how weakened he had been. Easy to attack. He stared at her. She hadn't attacked him, though. She had tended to him, had taken care of him, had been gentle and kind. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't. Not even now, when he felt more vulnerable than ever. She didn't want to hurt him. He sucked down a deep breath, released her hand, and told himself again that she didn't want to hurt him, that her concern was genuine, and she wasn't out to take advantage of his vulnerability. She wasn't like the others. His gentle little butterfly. He looked away from her, unable to look at her when he did this, exposed to vulnerability for the first time in forever, because he feared his other side would use it to seize control, to whisper poisonous things about her that he knew were untrue, but that would be his undoing. Esher carefully lifted the right side of his shirt and t-shirt, revealing the faint mark where the blade had plunged into his side just below his ribs. She frowned at it, and then lowered her gaze to his left side, to a wound that was still dark pink and healing.
Were you hurt again?
He shook his head. It happened before we met. She lifted her eyes to his.
But the other wound's healed.
It's healing, but I don't want to think about it. because whenever he thought about it, it filled his head with doubts, gave rise to fear that felt as if it was choking him. He looked at Aiko and realized he didn't want to think about anything right now. He just wanted to feel. He just wanted her. He wanted to continue this madness they had started, wanted her to drive him out of his mind so he didn't think about what she was. Because he couldn't think about it. If he did, he would end up hurting her. Gods, it was the first time he actually wanted to be driven out of his mind. Only he didn't want to be driven right into his other one. He wanted that part of him silenced, gone, locked away so it wasn't a danger to her. It had been when he had been touching her, lost in her, and it had been when she had touched him, before he had foolishly thought about what she was and what he was doing with her. Fuck thinking. It was overrated. Feeling was better. He took hold of her hand, shook only a little as he guided it towards his tight shaft, and gripped the waist of his trunks with his other hand. He needed her hand on him again, needed to feel it on his flesh this time. Now that he had started down this path, he didn't want to go back, didn't want to stop. It had been centuries, too long since anyone had touched him, his experiences of it so few that he could no longer remember what it had felt like. But Aiko's touch had been bliss. He wanted more of it. He wanted to forget everything else existed. There was only her in this world and this moment. He lifted the waist of his trunks, freed his cock, and moaned as he felt her gaze on him and looked at her. Her dark eyes were round, pupils blown with desire that ricocheted through him too, had him hot and needy, his shaft growing harder at just the thought of her touching him. The rain grew heavier, the scent of earth filling the strained air in the tea house. Before he could make her touch him, her hand moved forwards, taking his with her. He groaned and rolled his hips as her fingers skimmed down the length of his cock, from blunt tip to his balls, an exploratory touch that almost had him bursting. She shuffled closer, the scent of her perfume mingling with the heady aroma of her release, filling his lungs and pushing all rational thought to the back of his mind. Gods, he muttered beneath his breath as she took him in her hand, encircling his cock with her fingers, her skin hot against his. He released her and leaned back, couldn't stop himself as she moved her hand on him up and down, her touch light but devastating. He alternated between closing his eyes and staring at her, torn between a desire to do both as she gained confidence again. Her eyes remained rooted on his shaft, dark with need he could feel building inside her again, and he wanted to know her thoughts, needed to see if they matched the images coming to life in his mind, a vision of making love with her. She brushed her thumb over the exposed crown, sending heat rolling down the length of his shaft to his balls, and he groaned. Bliss. Divine. Her nerves rose, and he mustered enough brain cells to ask what was wrong. But before he could utter the words, she leaned over him and placed her free hand on his thigh. Her breath washed over the head of his cock, followed by a tentative flick of her tongue, and her hair brushed his stomach. Gods. He moaned as she tongued the crown, as she wrapped her lips around him and took him into her mouth, his hips bucking up to drive him into her wet heat. Some more noble part of him said to stop her, but fuck, he didn't want her to stop. He wanted to stay right where he was, wanted to feel her mouth on him like this forever. Pure pleasure rocked him as she explored him with her mouth, taking him deeper. She was hot and wet, like molten fire scalding him, and he tried to hold back. It became impossible when she circled the base of his cock with her hand and began moving on him, sliding her hand up and down in time with her mouth, making sure every inch of him felt the bliss of her caress. A moan rolled up his throat, and the urge to thrust deeper blasted through him, so powerful he lost himself to it, had his hand tangled in her pigtails before he was aware of what he was doing. He gripped her as she bobbed on him, pushing her back down whenever she retreated. She moaned, the muffled sound sending a wave of heat through him, a hit of pleasure that rivaled the feel of her mouth on his cock. Outside, the rain fell harder, growing heavier in time with the pleasure surging inside him, rising swiftly to crash over him. He grunted, each exhale a broken sound as his body rocked, writhed of its own will, searching for release. When it finally broke over him, his entire body quaked from the force of it, his hand tightening in her hair as he held her in place and jetted into her mouth, A strangled shout lodged in his throat. As the haze of pleasure dissipated and he grew aware of the world again, embarrassment swept in to crash over him as fiercely as his climax had. He released Aiko and hastily covered himself as she sat back, her cheeks pink, flushed with the pleasure he could feel in her. "Sorry for doing that," he muttered, feeling like a monumental dick in the aftermath of it, when it had felt so damned good at the time.
Don't be.
Her cheeks looked as if they wanted to grow a shade or two darker as she shyly added,
I liked it.
His did. Damn them. Esher buttoned his jeans and stared at her, reeling and trying to take in what had just happened, marveling at her as she fixed her appearance and kept glancing at him, little looks that stirred something inside him, in the region of his chest, and had a single thought flowing around his mind. He didn't want to hurt her. He would sooner harm himself than hurt her. Her face finally flushed darker, and she awkwardly smoothed one of the ruffles of her black skirt. "I'm sorry," he murmured, and dragged his eyes away from her, aware that his staring was the reason she felt embarrassed and nothing else, not what they had done. Gods, that had felt as natural as breathing. I haven't been with anyone like this in a long time. I'm not sure what to do, but I feel as if I should do something. Except feel like a royal idiot. Fuck, could he sound any more like one?
The rain stopped.
She managed a smile as she pointed towards the glass front of the building. Esher looked there, his eyebrows rising high on his forehead as he uttered, "Oh, would you look at that?" He cringed. What the hell was wrong with him? Acting all what a surprise and how odd, when he had been aware the rain had stopped dead the second he had climaxed. He had a feeling she was aware of it too. There was something he hadn't been aware of, though. He frowned at the sliver of sky he could see between the bottom of the roof and the trees across the lake. It was clearing now, revealing darker blue that signaled evening was approaching. "It's getting late," he said, and her eyes landed on him again. And when he looked across at her, a feeling struck him, a need that mastered him. He didn't want to take her home, didn't want to part from her yet. He needed her still. So he put it all out there, risked what felt like everything in that moment. "Are you hungry?" She seemed to consider it for a moment before nodding.
There's a nice restaurant near here.
"I live close by." The words left him in a knee-jerk way, bursting from his lips as the thought of sitting in a crowded restaurant sent darkness surging through him. He didn't want to let it come over him, not because he might hurt her, because he realized now that was impossible, but because he didn't want her to see that side of him. He didn't want to frighten her away. He realized he might have been a little too forward when she just stared at him. After what had happened to her on the train, she had every right to find it hard to trust another male. His first thought was to tell her that she could trust him. But could she really? While he didn't want to hurt her, couldn't hurt her, he couldn't say the same of his other side. If it took control, he wasn't sure what he would do to her. "Forget it. I'll walk you home." It was the more sensible course of action, especially when he considered that it would be dark soon, and the gate might need defending or a hellspawn might want him to open it. Or worse. His brothers might show up at the mansion, popping in right in front of her to scare the shit out of her. The thought of them doing such a thing had his darker side surging to the fore. But it wasn't his other self this time. It was the darkness born of his father's blood, a dangerous brand of possessiveness that was almost intoxicating, had him feeling a little hazy and vicious as he stared at Aiko, a need to wrap his arms around her and keep her all to himself beating in his veins. He would kill anyone who tried to take her from him, including his brothers. The thought left him cold, threw a bucket of icy water over the dark desire to possess her, and shook its grip on him, giving him back control. He would never harm his family. "Esher?" Aiko's soft voice pierced the dark veil of his thoughts, and he blinked and looked at her, found her kneeling closer to him, the press of her hand light against his cheek.
I would love to have dinner with you.
He stared at her, fighting to take in her words and make himself comprehend what she was telling him. She wasn't talking about going to a restaurant. She was talking about dinner at his place. She was trusting him with her safety, trusting that he wouldn't hurt her. And God's, he would do his best to live up to that trust. He would show her that she had been right to place her faith in him. He grinned at her. "I'm a great cook,"